Ateneo Literary and Cultural Festival. So what is the Literary and Cultural Festival about? It gathers the university community, book publishers, local writers, literary enthusiasts, thought leaders, and cultural entrepreneurs to promote literacy and explore untapped opportunities for innovation and enterprise in the creative industries in the country and beyond. This festival highlights emerging and established writers while fostering intellectual discourse, cultural exchange, creative enterprise, and literary excellence. It offers insights into the Philippine publishing industry, provides advice to aspiring authors, and promotes discussion on literature's role in bridging cultural divides, especially LGBTQIA+ issues. In doing so, the ALCF, or shortened the ALCF, provides a safe laboratory for bold intellectual experimentation, innovative thinking, and new synergy between scholarly communities and the creative industries. So yesterday was our first day. In the AM session, we featured publishers such as Exploding Galaxies, Tibok Bookstore, the first LGBT plus bookstore in the Philippines. We also featured Gantala Press, and Everything's Fine. If you are interested, they are selling their merchandise near the old Rizal Library. So you may check out these works. Some of them are not available in library, so it may be good to perhaps take a look at the titles that they are offering. Yesterday afternoon, we also featured Adam David of Better Living Through Xeroxography. So in the morning, we presented independent presses. But in the afternoon, we focused on zine making and the production of, let's say, reading materials, books that are made by hand. It may be ephemeral, but the goal is to express autonomy and reassert power for individuals who would want to write. Today is an extension, at least, of the aims and goals of yesterday's discussions. Today we will focus on the three writers from the Ateneo de Manila University. We will have Kaisa Aquino, Alan Pastrana, and Martin Villanueva. Okay. Before we proceed further, let me introduce the Dean of the School of Humanities, Dr. Patricia Lambino, to deliver the opening remarks. Everyone, let's welcome Dr. Lambino.
Thank you very much. A warm welcome to everyone, although I think I don't need to welcome you anymore if you're students. I'm very happy that you are here to listen to what the LCSP has prepared. Warm thanks and gratitude really to LCSP for organizing this. I think this addresses a need. Now, this festival addresses the need to connect writers to the industry to writers, and all the other connections that you can imagine that this festival facilitates. Second, I would also want to thank this is a panel, a round table. Kaisa, Alan, Martin, you are very lucky to be hearing the behind the scenes. You are very lucky to get these typically introverted writers to be talking about what it takes. This is a special occasion, so I hope you cherish the moment and you make the most of the festival. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean Lambino. So we will have a roundtable discussion. We will have the three writers seated in front, and they will be moderated by Mr. Francis Soliano, also a faculty member of the Literary and Cultural Studies program. Let me just briefly share with you the life story, the bio notes of the authors. So first we have Kaisa Aquino. She is the author of the novel Isabella, available at the Ateneo University Press. Her other writing has appeared in Katipunan, Likhaan, the Best Asian Short Stories 2019, and in Paliwanag, Translating Feminisms. She teaches creative writing at the Department of Fine Arts in the Ateneo de Manila University. Everyone, let's welcome Kaisa Aquino. Yay! Okay, yan. Go, Kaisa. Okay, next. Alan Justo Pastrana is a writer, musician, and teacher. Many of his poems have appeared in various anthologies and journals like Cordite Poetry Review, Diliman Review, Tomas, Likhaan Book of Poetry and Fiction, and Vagabond Press Asia Pacific Writing Series. He has published 2 poetry books, Body Hall, available at UST Publishing House, and Field, available at Good Intentions Books. Pastrana teaches at the Ateneo de Manila University. Okay, everyone, once again, let's welcome Mr. Alan Justo Pastrana. Last but not the least, we have Sir Martin Villanueva. He is the author of the poetry collections This Is How to Me No Harm and Account, and the essay collection A Pig Was Once Killed in Our Garage. In the Ateneo de Manila University, he teaches creative writing at the Department of Fine Arts, advises thesis projects for the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies, and is an associate editor of Kritika Kultura. Everyone, once again, let's welcome Martin Villanueva. Okay, also, let me introduce our facilitator, a colleague of mine, Francis Soliano. He specializes on law and literature. He will help facilitate the discussion. Okay, sige. Everyone again, welcome Francis. Sige. Okay. That's it for me, so we will listen to them now speak.
Good morning everyone. Good morning Martin, Alan, Kaisa. Thank you for joining us in this conversation. I always work, in literature, I always work with an assumption that many Ateneans in fact are closeted writers. Diba na, they have written poems, stories perhaps, and we, as a community, we take inspiration from you, published writers of the Ateneo. So yung first question ko has to do with the time that you, where do you find the time to write? So in the Philippines, we know that writing is not a full-time job for most Filipinos. So we have a day job, we have our different projects, and yet, no, you find the time to write. No? So how do you protect that creative space, no? Time and space?
Regarding that question, I always go back to how I introduced my own book, which is that it was written within an academic program, so the time was given to me because I was part of that. So I think yun siguro yung entry point ko in engaging with the audience in that kind of conversation, since these are students, no? So my book was written as part of workshop classes, as part of the thesis program. So nandun yung oras niya. Although when I was also doing my MA, I was also working corporate. Maswerte lang yata ako kasi yung setup namin noon sa trabaho ko, parang paid yung hours ko while I was studying. Somehow, no, I was very lucky. So, yun. Hindi ko alam kung paano ko yun susundan ngayong hindi na ako estudyante. Baka sila merong sasabihin about that.
Ako din kasi, no, not the entire book. Yung first book ko, part of it, sa thesis class, sa thesis din, parang gano'n. So a lot of the, sa master's program, when I was doing my master's then, tapos I was working on some of the poems, but some of the poems were already existing before I before I took up my master's. Pero ganun din siya. The current book, meron ding ibang poems dyan na sinulat ko for my creative writing workshop classes din sa PhD. So parang ganun din siya. Malaking tulong sa akin yung, yung mismong, katulad ng sabi ni Kaisa, yung binibigay na oras nung program mismo for me to sort of write my poems. I think, for the most part, at least when I was writing these books, I needed that sort of setup, right? But now I also find myself, since I'm already working on a new project, I find myself like really needing the time to sit down and really write. So parang yung tanong kasi ni Francis na how do I protect that creative space, medyo mahirap talaga siya. Diba? Pero ang sinasabi ko, hindi katulad before when I was younger when you could rely on inspiration. Diba? Yung parang sinasabi ko lagi, sabi parang may naramdaman ka lang ng konti, pwede ka na magsulat ng tula, diba? Pero hindi na siya pwede ngayon. Kaya I needed that sort of discipline. Like I need to tell myself, you need to sit down and write. You need that needs to be part of your schedule. Kasi hindi ko siya magagawa kung wala siya sa schedule ko.
Sorry, nervous ako kasi parang I'm under the assumption that no one's really interested in us, no? Well, obviously, I can't complain about the impossibility of it in light of teaching responsibilities, no? Because my dean is here. Aside from that, ano ba? Like what they said, I think my first book is similar to Kaisa's and Alan's first book insofar it was primarily authored as part of a graduate school requirement. So at that point, you have, I don't know if you have time, but you have no choice but to carve time. Maybe the bigger feat is for those of us who have tried to continue to write even without that external parameter of earning a degree before the deadline for submitting a thesis elapses and you lose your scholarship, diba? I mean, those external deadlines are a wonderfully generative force. Without that, I mean, there's no romantic and even systematic answer to the question. It's just, you just find time, I guess. No? Baka kasama din imposter syndrome. We teach creative writing. So I think that's, for me anyways, that's also part of the pressure to find time. Like, who am I to give my students a hard time when I'm not giving myself a hard time too? No? So maybe the imposter syndrome helps also. Yeah. Can I say a joke? Sorry. Because a colleague of ours in the FA invited Alan and I to dinner last night. And we said yes. And Kaisa said no because Kaisa had work to do. Tapos yung joke namin ni Alan ay, kung poet ka, you can just write one line and you have the illusion that you're productive. If you're a novelist, di ba, parang you say no to dinners. No? That's joke, but maybe there's something to it. No? There's an illusion of productivity also that you can play. No? Yeah.
Thank you. And you have here the recent works that you've published. Maybe you can show your recently published works to the audience and maybe say a few words about your works. They're here, so maybe we can start with that. What do I say? About this.
Ayun. Latest book ko po, available sa Ateneo Press. It's being sold whereabouts? In the Rizal Library. No? Thank you, LCS, for organizing such. What did you...
Say a few words lang about
oh nga pala, is this being recorded? Oh, hello. It's my third book. Second book of poetry. So my first book was a book of poetry. That was my MFA thesis. The second book was a nonfiction book. And then yung pangatlo, poetry. The poems aren't all quote-unquote new, but the project became clear to me, specifically during the context of the pandemic. Just figured out a way to both collect old works and string it together with new works towards what would end up being This Is How to Mean No Harm. Maybe I'll end there. Maybe if there's more relevant topics to bring up as we proceed with our conversation, we can elaborate.
Yeah. Ako naman, ito. Field. Yung makita kasi black na black siya. Pero may mga kumikintab-kintab siya. No? Field. This is my second book. My first book is also a book of poems. This one took a while before I was able to finish it. But I've already said this in one of the forums we had before, na the book's main concern initially was really linguistic. So it was really the materiality of language. It wasn't topical. I wasn't really clear about what it was going to be. But I was trying to problematize the nature of language and how I could sort of use, how I could maybe approximate, at least during the time I was concerned about that, approximate the grammar of music, in a sense, how that might be useful in me writing poetry. That doesn't mean the book is about music. It's not necessarily, it's not really about music. But I was trying to approximate the largely abstract, very abstract, like grammar, structural grammar of music, you know, to sort of play with the language. Because for me, it's always about, for me, yung engagement ko with poetry is about playing with the language, about testing the limits of language, right? And then later on, it became about places and how places are shaped by particular powers, right? So it's basically critiquing the powers that shape our understanding of places, locations, and space in general. So yun.
Sa akin naman, this is my first book, so para akong bird just hatched out of the egg. This is also, again, as I said, my thesis. It's about Isabela. So parang yun yung naging writerly obsession ko, I suppose, because I left Isabela when I was 16 to study in Baguio. So parang palagi ko siyang sinusulat, palagi ko siyang sinusubukang i-reconstruct. Also, the project happened to be also my way of answering personal questions about certain people around me, and how I was raised, how I grew up, and basically that community. Tapos naging conceit ko siguro yun as a student na, no, I'll write a novel, kahit na parang essentially short stories siya. Pero I guess it's also trying to forward that kind of assertion na pwede siyang tawaging nobela kasi meron pa rin siyang iisang kwentong kinukwento, which is the story of the place and I guess the movement. Yeah.
For these works, and when you start any project in writing, do you imagine an ideal reader? And what I mean by that is the reader that the work.
I never really think about an ideal reader. That doesn't mean walang ideal reader. I just feel like I don't think about that at all. Pero halimbawa, for example, for this book, when I was writing it, when I eventually finished it, I know na may certain limitations. Like for example, this is bilingual, so it's a collection of poems. Well, it's not really just a collection of poems. I treat it as a sequence. So parang the verses would shift from English to Filipino, parang ganon. And I refuse to place any notes or explanations about these things. So in a sense, there is an assumption that largely Filipinos would be able to understand it, like because a lot of us at least are bilingual, at least, diba? Pero marami din tayo because some of us would know other languages, diba? Other local languages, diba? Or other foreign languages, pero we're mostly bilingual. So that's the assumption. Parang I'm not sure if this is going to be appreciated by anyone outside of the community, but also there's also that assumption then na yung level din, for example, ng understanding of Filipino, baka hindi rin pare-pareho yung level, di ba? So, pero hindi ko yung in-intend. Okay, parang para sa akin, klaro lang sa akin yung limitations ng project. Parang ganon. Yeah, yun pa lang yung naisip ko na, ano, pero I never really think about that consciously.
Ako super conscious ako doon. I think mostly because this is historical fiction, so I'm aware that the people who may read it may have experienced the particular moment. Yung sa forward nito, in-identify pa siya ni Ma'am Ruth Pison na parang post-ed sa literature, literary tradition. No? So parang naging conscious ako doon. Although this was also something I learned in the classroom na these are the people you're writing are people who may still have memories of this particular moment. So conscious ako doon kung parang paano kaya nila tatanggapin yung interpretation ko nung hindi ako nandun nung moment na yun sa sinusulat ko. So that, and also, parang since yung characters ko dito are revolutionaries, which I'm not, yung consciousness din na, yun yung takot ko nung una, parang, my God, paano kaya pag nabasa to ng taong nandun? Nabasa naman na siya. So, so far, wala namang parang, hindi ganyan. And I think that's because it's in the mode of fiction, particularly literary fiction pa siya, di ba? So, yung ganun na, parang dalawa siyang audience ng reader of historical fiction and also reader of the literary fiction type, which is different, di ba, sa genre fiction. So iba rin yung language niya in the sense na when you think about literature about, like mga revolutionaries, it doesn't come with that kind of language, particularly in English pa. So yung ganun, I was thinking about those things and I think now that the book is out there, I'm super conscious of how people from that particular way of life respond to the book. And so far, parang agree naman sila, I guess. So meron siyang parang shared truth, I suppose. That kind of shared consciousness that I can write about even if I'm not within that kind of movement.
Parang ito yung mga guide questions sa CW thesis, no? Mas mahirap pala siyang sagutin, no? Baka nag-hesitate ako dahil sa word ng audience. Kasi if I appreciate it using that word, it is for me to assume that this is being created specifically to be consumed by someone who buys the book, no? Which, on the one hand, I guess that's real, no? I mean, why would we submit it to a press that sells the book if we don't somehow buy into that or are complicit with that to some extent, no? Pero, in earnest naman, if I were to rephrase the question in a way that is more meaningful to me, baka sa ngayon, especially for this book compared to the first two, wasn't conscious of an audience, but very conscious of how the process and how possibly the output needed to carry itself out as a conversation with other people who have already said things about similar concerns. So I think more so this book than my previous book, there was a kind of intentional kind of conversing with other books. And if that is my way of being less self-indulgent and isolated, parang okay sa akin yun. The idea that, a lot of the concerns were quote-unquote personal and private, but I was sorting through it through language and rarely entirely my own. Meaning to say, I was really conversing with other people who've taken an earnest crack at the labor of finding an articulation or something. So in that sense, I would actually, espouse that kind of thinking. I'm not saying that not thinking about audience is the way to go, but I'm saying maybe other than just viewing it as audience is how do we make the writing practice and its subsequent output a conversational practice on different levels. No? And I suspect that minsan nga, conceiving things of having an audience in terms of someone who bought the book is like the least conversational relationship you could have, because you never talk to the reader, di ba? They just do it in private, no? And it's not like I want to be in their private life anyways, no? Pero yung integrity ng sarili kong private life, that it's not completely solitary, not free of influence to get into the title of the talk, no? Maybe that's how I would sort of be very Atenean and flip the answer a bit, flip the question a bit. No? I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
That's a very good point, Martin. And in fact, my maybe additional question is about yun nga, literary market. No? And as writers, how much of a looming presence is the literary market for you? Are you worried about it at all? Do you think that, do you think about it, again, when starting your own project, when you approach a publisher, and probably which publisher to approach for your completed work? Do you think that it is your concern at all? No? Kasi pwede rin na it's not really your concern. So yeah, what are your thoughts about the market? Kasi di ba, we have the stereotype of a starving artist. May because of course of the challenges sa market. Is that your concern, and how do you deal with that?
Para sa akin, hindi ko siya masyadong concern. Kahit before, when I was promoting my first book, parang meron ako, siguro mas active yung aversion ko dun sa idea ng market. It's like, why would I peddle my book? Parang I don't know how to do this. Parang I'm not, alam mo yun, parang I just wrote a book, tapos, you know, parang my publisher, the publisher of my first book was UST Press. The UST Publishing House. Tapos parang the marketing people, there was like telling me, Alan, you need to do this, parang ganyan. Importante kasi siya. Parang ako, hindi ko talaga siya nagigets. Parang, okay, why do I need to sell my book? Parang ganon. Ngayon, siguro medyo mas, hindi pa rin ganun ka-active. But I still question the whole concept, you know. I guess in a way, very critical pa rin ako doon sa idea ng market in the first place, like in general. Like, parang feeling ko kailangan lagi siyang scrutinize. Like, and even if we have like these ideas about like parang a mainstream market, like, di ba, or an indie market, like parang para lahat, all of these things, parang kailangan siya scrutinize in a sense. Parang may ganun pa rin akong feeling about it. But I guess, katulad nung sabi ni Martin kanina, parang in a way, di ba, that's very real. You submitting your work to a publisher, obviously, merong iba't ibang levels ng complicity nga, I guess, if you could call it that, like, dun sa pag-usad ng market, kung ano man yun, di ba? At kung paano man siya nagsisimula at lumalaki. At nagiging valuable dun sa usapan ng writing. Pero, para rin sa akin, baka mas importante rin kasi na makita natin kung yun nga, ano yung mga possibilities nung work outside of the market. Parang inisip ko din, baka pwede natin pag-isipan yun. Pero, yun, so far, yun pa lang yung naiisip ko tungkol dun sa market. So, hindi ko siya masyadong iniisip. Pero, aware ako na totoo siya, na reality siya. But also aware din ako na, for example, tulad na na-mention na natin kanina, na-mention mo, Francis, kanina, na kailangan pa rin natin ng day job. Klaro sa akin yan. Kasi hindi ako mabubuhay sa pagbebenta lang ng libro ko, di ba? Hindi talaga. So, kailangan ng day job. So, very real, I guess, neoliberal realities. Di ba? Na parang kailangan mong mag-participate sa ganitong klaseng system because of all of these challenges. So, parang the creative act itself, hindi siya enough, di ba? Para maging, para mabuhay ka kasi mas marami ibang levels nung realidad mo na kailangan mong i-address. Parang ganun. So, yan.
I guess same din yung sagot ko. Parang shock sa akin na natanggap to at bumibenta siya at may market siya. Parang siguro, I guess part siya dahil nga thesis ko siya. So parang in my head, isa lang siyang PDF file na kinokomentohan ng mga panel ko. Tapos ngayon libro na siya. Yung way ko rin siguro to connect to what Alan is saying is, parang siguro out of the three of us, ako yung parang least connected sa market. Kumbaga, halimbawa, yung mga blurb ng libro, lahat ng blurb ko, panelist ko yan. Yung forward ko, critic ko. Yung isa pang blurb, parang panelist din sa isang workshop. Parang yun lang yung way ko to kind of like sell the book, I suppose. Kasi ganun siya, di ba? Parang yun yung una nilang makikita eh. The blurb, the forward, whatever. So parang sa akin, talagang yung connections ko to the market is still tied to the academe. Galing pa rin siya sa classroom. So, parang humbled talaga ako every time nakikita ko na meron siyang 100 plus na benta sa Shopee. Yung ganun. Kasi, tas yung topic niya pa, yung theme. Tas hindi, ewan ko, parang ang grim-grim ng cover. Those are the things that I think about when I buy a book, right? Yung itsura ng cover, yung writer, kung sino yung nagbabasa sa kanya. And I think, regarding doon sa marketing side din, since una ko nga siyang libro, kahit anong sinabi ng publisher ko sa akin, gawin natin to. Sige, gawin natin lahat kung ano man yung gusto nang gawin. And I think that kind of paid off in the sense na I was super shocked and like positively na nung MIBF halimbawa, yung mga nagpapapirma sa akin galing Instagram. Like, they engage with the book via that platform. Wala nga akong presence sa Instagram din. So parang yung ganun na ang interesting sa akin nung journey ng libro ko na mula sa classroom, tapos nabenta siya, tapos ngayon nasa BookTok siya, nasa Instagram siya, so yung ganun. At yung topic niya, parang, wow, we're talking about like the National Democratic Movement sa ganitong platforms. Parang, di ba? So sa akin, I'm still like trying to piece it together that that's the reality of the book now. And I think that's really fascinating. And the fact that I'm fascinated by that, I think parang talagang hindi mo yun yung view if you're inside of the book. I don't know if that makes sense. Yun. Okay ba yun?
What was the umbrella question? Market. That's the key word. What's the question? Well, I guess we're throwing around the word market, but the definition of terms that I'm struggling is what kind of market are we even talking about? No? Baka there's assumption that there's a literary market and all that. No? I'll speak personally. No? Parang maybe the basic question is, why would I submit to an academic press? Or why would I submit to an Ateneo press? To Ateneo de Manila University Press, who they've been nothing but kind to me. No? Pero there is a very practical concern here. No? I am a tenured faculty member in a university, and part of how we are assessed is publication. And whether everyone here knows it or not, the university system has a very specific way with which it, quote-unquote, counts which publications count in their eyes and which ones don't. Does that make sense? So there is, in a weird kind of way, there's a connection there to my chosen profession or the way I make a living, insofar as similar to how our friends in science researchers, they have to continually find quote-unquote legitimate scholarly journals to publish their stuff, not only for the importance and romance of knowledge production, but also for their own sort of, we're not going to get wealthy, diba? It's more like it's their own career standing, their own sort of positioning in that market. There's a little bit of that siguro playing into, I can't say I think about it to that literal level, but yes, it does play into my thinking. And my first book was self-published, no? And that currently is not recognized by the university. So I always say I have 3 books, but my university, isn't in my official employment records and my evaluation. I only have 2 books because I cannot claim my first book. Or I can list it, pero I wouldn't have gotten a publication award from the university, and I did not get it. No. So there is that real-world element to the decision to submit to a press, and to me that expands the notion of a market. Am I really participating in a literary market? I suppose, but it's also a literary market in the Philippines that oftentimes is so tied to the academe. And those of us who try to occupy a space external to the academe, parang reactionary din siya sa academe, no? So napaka-central pa rin, it seems sometimes, yung academic world in the literary ecosystem, for better or for worse. So I hope I expanded the conversation konti, pero yeah.
Thank you for that, Martin. In fact, Alan also mentioned the university. Kaisa produced her work as part of a university requirement. And the university, of course, is probably the most important institution, but not the only institution. And maybe we can, in line with expanding the conversation, how about the other institutions that probably can support your work? Is that also like an influence on the works that you do? Like, I'm thinking of residencies, competitions, the palanca. So it's not just publishing, diba? Parang the writer wears many hats, so to speak. Sometimes you're a teacher, sometimes you're probably a panelist in a workshop because you got invited, probably as a judge in a literary competition, etc. Meron pa kayong masasabi dun sa experience niyo so far, no, as writers?
I guess sa akin yung very real na, and sinasabi ko lagi sa kanila to, like, ay kayo magkakasama. Tatlong kaibigan to. No, para sa akin, very real yung, for example, yung pag-enter ko sa literary community, it was because I won a campus literary competition. Because I wouldn't have known. Kasi I came from a different world. I wasn't a literature major. I wasn't a creative writing major. I was a music major. I was in a different building. Malayo sa kanila. Wala akong kilala sa kanila. Wala akong kilala ng writers. I just saw it sa isang advertised sa campus paper that there's a literary competition sa UST, Ostetica. And then I joined. And then, nagulat ako that I actually won. But hindi ko siya ina-expect. So, kasi noong time na yun, I was writing, but I didn't. Siguro, in a way, I wanted to know kung, is this good enough? Is it worth pursuing? Parang ganon. And I wouldn't have known really. Kasi wala din ako mentors. I wouldn't know people from the literary community. So, nung nanalo ako dun sa competition, that was the beginning of everything. Diba? And I would, but meron pa rin akong ibang mga competition na dahil pag nanalo ka, mas makikilala ka pa, parang ganon, di ba? Totoo sa akin yun, very real lahat yung nangyari na yan. But that doesn't necessarily mean you can't be critical about those competitions. Parang feeling ko, pareho din siya eh, dalawang level din yun. Alam ko yung, naiintindihan ko na ngayon din yung level, yung possible na levels nun, parang ganon. Na alam ko na, let's say, there are certain competitions na yung ginagawa ko, hindi talaga siya papasok kahit anong mangyari, parang ganon. Inisip ko, may impluwensyahan ba yung pagsusulat ko, yung style ng writing ko just because I need to win a competition. So never ko siyang gagawin. Parang I would insist on writing the way I write, you know. Parang as much as possible, I try not to be, pressured by all of these other institutions, di ba? I need my writing to be a product of that sort of constant reflection and awareness of many different factors. So parang hindi lang talaga siya nakabase dun sa institutions. Although klaro sa akin yung, 'di ba, yung ganong yung possible na influence ng ibang institutions sa writing. Pero sa akin yun, kumbaga klaro sa akin yun na yung experience ko na experience ko with these other institutions, like yung mga competitions nga, nakatulong siya kung, di ba, kung paano ko binuo kung paano ako pumasok sa literature or sa creative writing. Yun.
Wala akong awards. Ano ba? Kasi yung mga spaces kung saan naboto, maski yung workshops, tali pa rin siya sa university, so same institution. Siguro kung meron man akong maiaambag somehow. Interesting to kasi pinasa ko rin to sa Palangka. Tapos habang nag-aantay, pinasa ko rin siya sa Ateneo Press. Nauna yung Ateneo Press nauna naman magsabi lang yung Ateneo Press na babasahin siya, pero hindi siya nanalo sa Palangka. Hindi ko matandaan kung sino yung nanalo sa year na yun, pero yung Bittersweet Land yata na nobela, I think from the Visayas yung writer. So, yun, talagang ang realization ko sa tanong na yan ay ang nakaangkla talaga entirely yung work sa institution, and by that I mean the university, as in UP. So, yung isa pang nasabi rin sa akin noon, ang challenge sa writer after nung ganong uri ng breakthrough work ay, since ito kasi nasulat din siya alongside someone mentoring you, kasi meron kang advisor. So ngayon, paano mag-proceed yung writer beyond that, which I'm trying to answer. So ngayon, nag-apply din ako sa certain residencies na ang hirap, kasi ito lang yung meron ka pa. Parang ganon. Yun, hindi ko alam. Yun lang yung ano ko.
I have a question for Alan, Kaisa, Charlie, others around Carissa. I don't know, parang the whole conversation about institutions and opportunities, no? Parang I'd like to think na compared to, let's say, when Alan and I were coming up, parang wonderfully mas bukas yung opportunities and venues currently for writers, such that it's no longer sort of like the script where you have to go to a National Writers Workshop, you have to do this thing, you have to do that thing. Certainly when I was in college, there was a formula. Like there was no way I was going to be a writer from Ateneo and not be a member of Heights. Like that's just inconceivable, diba? So or by the same token, maybe in UST where Alan was, sali ka sa Estetika, diba? Parang ganun. Sumali din ako sa Palangka, diba? And again, I'm not here to sort of critique those institutions. After all, several of them have been and in development, no? But I think, as evidenced by some of the topics in this literary festival, no, it's really symptomatic of, I think, a shift that took place, or slow developments that continue to take place, where institutions that once perhaps held so much power to the point of being ultimate gatekeepers, they're also tempered by other ways of supporting artists and writers that hindi naman nakatali sa ganung klaseng institutional, that high-level institutional support. No? So, a term that I got from a friend from another country, parang which I've come to love, is this idea of the idea of a community of practice. No? So parang maybe talking about sino yung ideal audience mo. Kung hindi, ano sa tingin mo sa ngayon? Kasi that changes. No? Ano yung community of practice mo? Which means na who is literally involved in how you develop a work, and who is involved and how are they involved in the way your work is shared and read? How are you involved in reading the work of others? Does that make sense? No? So on the one hand, maybe once upon a time, it would be attending every damn Ateneo University Press launch held in Ateneo. All the more at the time, hindi masyadong strict ata yung security, di ba? You can just go in. But ngayon, it involves maybe attending that, and I hope we support who's our colleague launching soon. Like XC is launching a book next week on campus. No? On the one hand, like every weekend, di naman every weekend, di ba? Pero if you're on social media or you have friends, no, you'll get a message saying, hey, there's a zine fest somewhere in Makati or in Cubao. Hey, there's an activity somewhere else. No? So, para sa akin, napaka buhay. some of us old folks, older folks, I won't name names, but like the conversation came up, parang I don't know, parang the measures of being recognized or affirmed are so varied that sometimes it feels uncomfortable for some of us who've actually tried to get the recognitions that we once upon a time were believed to be required. No? Pero ngayon, napaka-varied, and I think that's a good thing. And my attitude is, baka kasama din sa responsibility natin to be aware of that overall landscape. Because I also want to believe that the choices we make, part of the responsibility is understanding the choices that you make, di ba? Parang, okay, for this particular book, ganito ang tip kong gawin, right? So yun. I hope that answers the question. No? And I don't think that's just a local thing, like globally, ganun na, no? And even the internet and everything. And and I just hope that, I know this is an LCS event, no? Parang that's a great, also honestly, a dissertation topic din eh, na the ever-changing landscape of literary production and communities of practice in Philippine literature. No? I'm sure people have written about it here and there. No? Pero maganda siya to... dissertation mo na yan. Tapos ka na. No, parang it's worth... I'm never gonna do it. Pero it's a compelling topic. I'd like to think we discuss it in our creative writing classes. No? It's not like what makes a good poem. It's like... for whom? And on what terms can we call it good? No? Ayan. Okay.
And that, yes, that gives us a lot of hope, diba, that there's that kind of vibrancy that's we see, that we observe, diba, in communities of practice. My next question is about your idols naman. Diba, when in almost all crafts, we probably start our love for that craft because of an encounter with a person, say a personality, or of a work. For example, in my case, I remember I realized that I wanted literature after reading Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Di ba? Parang, so what's your relation, in your case, di ba? Especially that maybe your teachers in your creative writing classes, I don't know, sort of also at some point became your idols, etc. Does that, what's the dynamics of your relationship with that with that idol? No? Does it change? And it's because it's also very complex. There's probably a time na, as part of your maturity, you realize that you have to question also that idol, etc. So, can you have, do you have thoughts on that?
Siguro yung first encounter ko lang muna siguro, yung very yung unang-una ko encounter, like, kasi nga, di ba, sabi ko nga, hindi ako lit major, hindi rin ako CW major, tapos, nag-music ako, tapos nagkataon lang, nabasa ko yung isang poem ni Adrienne Rich sa isang American literature textbook na dinala ng mom ko. My mom used to work with the Bureau of Corrections. So parang she used to teach prisoners. Parang gano'n. Tapos meron silang library. So nung bata pa ako, dinala niya ako nanghiram siya ng book doon. Tapos, yun nga, American lit book na dinonate lang ng some institution doon nga sa New Bilibid Prison. So yun. So binasa ko lang siya, tapos nakita ko lang yung tula ni Adrienne Rich. Tapos yun, simula na yun. And it led me to other poets, parang ganon. And then later on, makakabasa ka na rin ng, ewan ko, siguro yun nga yung, pero very telling din yun na unang experience ko is not a Filipino writer, but diba, an American writer. Diba? Yeah, tapos, pero hindi, later on, diba, may encounter mo din yung, so from Adrian Rich, diba? Then I remember Stephen Dobbins, that brought me to Stephen Dobbins, Dennis Johnson, like all of these people, Caroline Forche, tapos, syempre, Ofelia de Malanta, I'm just dropping names, like Ofelia de Malanta, Marjorie Evasco, diba? I mean, Crip Yuson, Jimmy Abad. So, di ba, yung hindi, yun nga eh, yung parang, yung connection ko for some writers na to parang ganun, di ba? Yung, eventually yun nga, katulad sabi ni Francis, ma-outgrow mo naman talaga sila. Pero yung first realization mo of, okay, you're trying to understand like, what are the possibilities of this genre? Like, in my case, poetry. Tapos I'm also testing the limits of the language. And after all of this, like, writers na medyo nasa the modern lyric tradition pa ganun. And then eventually, pinag-usapan namin ito ni Martin kagabi lang, and then pupunta ka na dun sa other people who might not necessarily have influenced me directly, but also their works made me realize na, okay, pwede palang gawin to. Ito pala yung ways to test the limits of language. For example, Mabi David, Paulo Manalo, Jello Suarez, like all of these people parang nakaklaro sa akin na, okay. Pero ito mga contemporaries ko to, hindi naman masyado malayo yung mga edad namin eh. So, but yun yung relationship mainly dun sa mga writers na to. Pero eventually, like sa grad school, meron akong very direct na relationship where magiging teacher mo sila sa workshop classes like Sir Jimmy Abad, for example. Yes, pwede ko na sabihin na naging teacher ko, national artist. Si Sir Jimmy, hindi kami masyado nagko-connect sa level na iba yung sinusulat niya tula, iba rin sinusulat ko tula. Pero sobrang na-appreciate ko si Sir Jimmy kasi kahit na sobrang formalist siya, na-appreciate niya yung ginagawa ko tapos hindi siya dismissive. Never naging dismissive si Sir Jimmy ever sa classes niya. Parang kahit na, since sabi niya, I'm a formalist, so parang alam niya, he needs to exert more effort to sort of understand what I'm trying to do. Sabi niya, iba na yung mga ginagawa mo, parang ganyan. Tapos, pero never siyang dismissive. So I love that about him. Like, ganun yung relationship. So, wala naman kasi yung masyado yung parang, naging teacher ko sila, naging mentor ko sila. Like, even Neil Garcia for that matter. Iba din yung ginagawa namin ni Neil Garcia. Naging mentor ko din siya. Pero klaro yun sa amin na parang yung relationship talaga is walang necessary na connection dun sa ginagawa ko. So kahit magkaiba yung ginagawa namin, it's possible to have that sort of relationship as mentor-mentee.
I was fortunate, creative writing undergraduate ko dito sa Ateneo. Was fortunate to have, I'd rather not name their names, no, pero I was fortunate to have two teachers in particular who, because I think reading to me had always seemed like an intimidating thing. No? It's like, I don't know kung uso pa rin to, Charlie, no? Pero yung idea na parang you're not, my element of parang, if you're a real writer, you should have read XYZ. No, parang there's like this kind of master list of requisite readings. And ever since I was a kid, I've always been sort of put off by some older person telling me that you're not good enough unless you do these things. No? So by some stroke of luck, I had two teachers, lit teachers as well as, one was a lit teacher, the other was a creative writing teacher who did not present reading and writing to me in this way. And possibly because at the time, well, obviously at the time we were all younger, no? Pero the age gap between me and them was not that great. And maybe that contributed to this weird feeling of why is this professor genuinely asking for my opinion as opposed to testing me. And then once those informal out-of-class correspondence happened, it became a very joyous experience. No? So in terms of my idols, in terms of gateway drug dealers. Sila yun. And I hope, I mean, I aspire to surface that way now that I'm in a position to teach. Ganun lang yan. In terms of, if it's a reading, and I don't really want to talk about it because feeling ko, I don't know, parang pretentious siya pag-usapan. No? Pero through one of these teachers, I was introduced an anthology called The Next American Essay, edited by John de Agata. And at the time, it really blew my mind and opened up a lot of conversations that to me were exciting. And in as much as I don't think I'm a big fan of that book anymore, I'm not afraid, I'm not embarrassed that that is a formative discovery at a time where I was maybe vulnerable to being influenced very easily by something very novel. No? But I think I'm still living off the remnants of that, the force of that influence, even if the actual content of that influence are beginning to be things that I now question. But the idea is I still remember that feeling na, ganito ba kayo? Parang when you, parang may pagka-novelty na feeling mo na kami lang nang babasa nito. No? So may element of parang it's like when you discover like a band that no one else is listening to, no? Feeling mo cool ka. No? So that kind of excitable force impressing itself on an impressionable college student who was very insecure and an introvert. I think in many ways I'm still living off some of the fumes of that discovery, no? Even if the content of the discovery is things that I don't necessarily agree with anymore.
Medyo juvenile, nare-realize ko yung perspective nung sa akin kasi when I was an undergrad student, my teachers weren't writers. I did language and literature in Baguio. Hindi sila creative writing kasi I think my course is mostly parang half complete, half linguistics style, parang ganun. So my path to acquiring my kind of reading practice was shaped by the internet, like Tumblr, ganyan. So parang ang una kong touch point sa nobela na nagustuhan ko ay Looking for Alaska ni John Green. So mga ganong vibes yung mga una kong binabasa. And I guess it kind of evolved as I was parang integrated in the community of Baguio writers. Nakilala ko na si Luisa E. Gloria, Macan Santos. So dun siya nag-grow. And interesting yung idea sa akin nung idol. Kasi when I think about it, I think merong distance na parang malayo siya. Parang binabasa mo lang siya. So kung meron man akong ganun, siguro yung pinakamalapit ay si Elaine Castillo. Like, I really loved her book, yung America's Not the Heart, to the point that I found her Instagram and then I messaged her. Parang, hello po, ang ganda-ganda ng libro ninyo. I was gushing. As in, sabi ko, taga Isabela ako, Ilocano, ganyan-ganyan. And it was so nice because she responded in earnest na parang nag-apologize pa siya kasi may mali daw yung Ilocano, ganyan-ganyan. Na totoo, may mga errors. Pero parang, ang ganda, parang yung ganun sa akin na, although ang important siguro dun ay na-discover ko yung America's Not the Heart because of a recommendation given to me by my panelists during Ateneo workshop. May ganun pa rin siyang connection, ha? Glenn Diaz. Yung parang sabi niya, dapat parang ganito ata yung gusto mong gawin, sabi niya. Akala niya nabasa ko na, so hindi pa. So binasa ko kagad siya. And then, I guess parang ganun siya sa akin. So halo siya na, hanggang ngayon pa din, most of my reading interest or influence, yung parang sinabi ni Martin na, ikaw lang, feeling mo ikaw lang yung nagbabasa ng mga ganito. So yung mga Jonathan Safran Foer, Nicole Cross, yung yung mga ganong mga Jewish people, parang binabasa ko, and then I'm resonating, parang, huh? But I guess yun yung power ng fiction, yung meron talagang shared thing that makes you want to further read more of these people and find out about them. Kaya ako na-discover si Nicole Cross kasi nalaman ko na dati siyang asawa ni Jonathan Safran Foer. Mga ganon. And I think, tali pa din siya, I guess, sa ganun na, kung sa teachers naman, yun din, mga workshop classes that kind of shape the way that you view your own work in relation to that an existing tradition. Okay na ba yun?
Yes, so in fact, this is my last question. It's a very general question, so that we can also include in the conversation the audience. So all of you are creative writing teachers, no? And I don't know. Sometimes in our classes, diba, we have that one big idea that we want to share with our students. And sometimes we end our semester with that one big idea. Or, di ba, in our imagination, if my students can get this one big idea, then I think the class is a success. No? Do you have that? Meron ba kayong ganun? And probably we can end our conversations with that message to the audience. Yung one big idea that you have for your students.
Hindi, siguro, inisip ko, siguro pag as a creative writing teacher, lagi ko ina-emphasize yung, I guess, yung openness ng writing. I'm thinking, I mean, between like lineage genius, the rejection of closure, for example. May mga magpo-poetics class dito. Aralin nyo na siya. Required. Lineage genius, rejection of closure. And merong arts, like kung mention din, si John Berger sa The Moment of Cubism, you know, trying to move away from, hindi naman move away. I think they're not necessarily, this is not necessarily better than that, but pero magkaiba lang sila. Moving from the idea that literature can be a mirror, or something like that, di ba? I mean, beyond that, what else? Can you know, like, kasi nga dahil ano ko with language, yung openness ng language, for example, and yung consequences, possible political consequences nun, Lin Hejian talking about that in Rejection of Closure. Siguro importante sa kanya, kasi parang inisip ko, yung play ba natin with language, especially with poetry, dahil yun yung genre ko, yun yung concern ko, parang wala ba siyang political implications. Pero marami siyang political implications to actually forward this kind of play with language where you try not to work with, let's say, something linear, which can be misconstrued as something absolute and monolithic, na that's the only way to view the world. Pero if you work with language and play with language and test the limits of language, you're always engaging with the world continuously. Diba? You don't see yourself separate from the world, but you're part of it in a sense, in the whole complexity of it. Parang ganun. So yun lang.
Sana lang ang ending natin. Ikaw ang mag-wrap. Ikaw ang biggest idea. Hindi, simple lang kasi yung sa akin. Since I'm mostly in contact with fiction students, at ang interest nila palagi, or I guess ang entry point to fiction ay Western fiction, to the point na mas nauunang nilang nababasa si Rick Riordan kaysa like Greg Brillantes, mga ganun. So parang palagi ko lang sinasabi na, where are you writing from? Kung nasa Pilipinas ka, kahit pa yung genre mo ay, you know, all this big ideas about, you know, an imagined place, whatever, in the outer space, you're still writing in Quezon City. So parang ganun yun na, how then does that affect the way that you present your world, the reality of your world? Because I think meron siyang tali. So parang palagi siyang paghahanap nung how you are able to ground your project with your reality. And yung interesting pa rin naman yun, yung incongruity nung sinusulat mo sa realidad mo. Parang meron pa rin yung tension, and I think doon nag-emerge yung insight about the genre, about the practice. So sa akin, palaging ganun na, okay, sige, you can write about isekai, ganyan, all of these magical things. Pero nasa Maynila ka, and you're writing in a language that isn't yours. So parang how then does that affect the way that you perceive your craft? Parang yun yung sa akin.
Biggest idea. Wala na. Nahihirapan ako sa tanong. Hindi ako ganon mag-isip ata na may central thesis yung bawat class ko. Also conscious of the fact that I do have some students here. So baka yung big idea ko parang completely lost pala. Parang they thought of something else. Diba? Parang, pero naalala ko because I don't teach fiction. But sometimes fictionists are in my class in a non-genre specific class like poetics. No? And one of the things that I recall saying a lot is, what if we took you seriously? And I think that's my big message at that. Because I think oftentimes, whether we want to admit it or not, I think a lot of us got into writing for very personal and therefore private reasons. No? And if we proceed from that premise, then why do you even submit to a class where it's going to be graded or workshop, diba? So parang you got my point. So I guess that's my selling thing. Like what if we actually took the things that you keep private for your own little whims? What if we actually took it seriously? No, yun ata yung big message ko. No, I'm coming from the idea that I don't think it's far-fetched for me to say that I think a lot of us got into writing for, again, very selfish and personal reasons. And to me, more than, although my students tell me that I should follow Pastrana's lead and give more affirmation. But I'd like to think that part of what makes it potentially significant as a community experience is if we're taking what each
Mahirap nga sagutin yung tanong. Mahirap nga sagutin yung tanong. But yeah, in fact, yeah, one thing that I thought about listening to your answer is, parang yung question na, can creative writing, or to what extent can creative writing really be taught? Diba? Parang yun yung isang question that I got to mind. But now maybe we can include the audience to the conversations. We now proceed to the open forum. There are mics on both sides, so you can approach the mics and maybe introduce yourself before you ask your question.
Hi everyone, it's me, Luisa Gomez. Ako yung nagre-require. Yeah. So just curious lang, could you describe your first experience of rejection ng submission or manuscript, and how did you get over it? Parang ganun.
Are we still talking about writing? First experience of rejection, probably submitting, once upon a time, it was a big deal-ish to submit to a weekly thing called the Philippine Free Press, which used to be published weekly, and then they would publish, like typically, diba, one short story and several poems, no? At dahil weekly siya, diba, parang nagiging habitual din that every once in a while you'd submit, no? And because it's weekly, it felt less daunting to me anyways than submitting to Heights, which only publishes twice a year. Na parang, masakit. Pero baka dahil creative writing major ako, so in many ways, sanay ako sa rejection. Even sa class, diba? It prepares you for that naman. Pero yeah, masakit, no? Maybe ang magandang, I was scared out of my mind the first time I submitted an entire book manuscript. Kasi okay lang kung isang work lang na reject eh, pero when you submit in it, like, when I submitted a pig to the press, that's like 300 pages of like, oh my God, that's a lot of vulnerability, you know. But yeah, pero there's no profound response, parang masakit. Pero you just get used to it.
First rejection ko. First rejection, parang katulad din ng free press, big thing din during that time. Wala na yata, meron pa ba? Panorama? Meron pa ba? Yeah, pero panorama. And nung time, ang graphic din, syempre, Nick Joaquin, right? Tapos ang panorama was Cirilo Bautista, so parang national artist. Pero inisip ko, sige, si national artist naman yung nag-reject ng tula ko, so okay lang. Si Cirilo Bautista, at least pwede ko sabihin, oy, nireject yung tula ko ng national artist. But anyway, katulad ng sabi ni Martin, hindi siya siguro lang ganong klaseng profound na insight. Mahirap siya, masakit din, yes. Pero iniisip ko lang na madedefine ba siya? Siguro, things that you tell yourself, just so you could, di ba, get over it. Madedefine ba nung rejection ko yung pagsusulat ko? Up to what extent ko siya kayang i-accept na yung, just because I'm rejected, because my works are rejected, hindi na worth it magsulat. Na feeling ko na paniwala ko yung sarili ko. Successful ako na paniwala ko yung sarili ko na hindi siya madedefine. Hindi ka madedefine nun rejection na yan, parang ganon. So kailangan mo lang talaga magsulat. Parang ganon. So siguro kung hindi mo kaya ng rejection, baka, I don't know, baka hindi ka dapat nagsulat. I don't know. Hindi, pero yun nga, feeling ko kahit, kasi, ano siya kailangan talaga, you're able to go past that. Kasi yung mga rejections, magagaling siya sa, yung pinag-usapan natin ng mga institutions, di ba? So, yun nga, willing ka ba tanggapin na yung institutions lang yung pwedeng mag-define ng worth mo as a writer? Parang ganon, di ba? Saka, marami namang questions, di ba? Ba't ka nga ba nagsusulat? Para ka kanino ka nagsusulat? Di ba? So, ibig ba sabihin, yung mga bagay na yan that are important to you can be defined by the institutions? Feeling ko hindi. So, feeling ko successful ako sa pagpapaniwala sa sarili ko na hindi. So, kahit na may rejections. At saka, by the way, hindi lang, yung rejections, hindi lang siya sa simula ng career ninyo. Lagi may rejection. Until now, nakatanggap pa rin ako ng rejection. So, it's a fact of life for writers. Sino ba?
Wala pa ako masyadong maraming submissions sa mga places, which I'm realizing now, no. Kung meron man siguro akong masasagot, recorded, okay lang naman siguro sabihin, no. Na-reject yung isa kong short story sa isang issue ng likhaan. Pagkabalik, ni-revise ko, sinubmit ko ulit nung iba yung editor. Tapos natanggap siya. So, try and try. Keep trying.
Sige na, don't be shy.
Good morning, good morning. Hello, thank you for coming for this talk. So, ma'am, during our chismis session, I remember you mentioned how exciting and frustrating it is that your students now, or young Filipinos in general, if that's too big a word, was that your students now, how the way that they write and read as well is so different, how it's no longer focused on realism, that they view things differently. So this question is for everyone. I'm not exactly sure how it applies to poetry and nonfiction, but that's interesting as well. I'm wondering, how do you feel then about these change in habits of reading and writing of your students, or again broadly, if you can, young Filipinos today? What interests you? What irritates you? Which parts do you approve and disapprove of?
Okay, thank you, Fermin. I feel challenged by it, and this is coming from someone who also engages somehow with these new practices. Like, I do read webtoons, aware naman ako sa mga ganong trends. Ang joke nila sa akin, nasa old tradition of fiction, paraw yata ako. Pero yung sinabi mo na hindi na siya realist, I think naman siya, paano ba? Parang collective naman siya, na syempre nagpro-progress yung mga trends, di ba? Yung traditions. Although definitely the realism in fiction, talagang siya yung pinakasikat somehow in a certain era. It's evolving now, meron na mga speculative. I'm challenged by it in the sense na interesting yung tanong na to kasi it's also a shared topic between me and other teachers in other universities teaching creative writing. At shared yung thought na maski sa mga nakausap kong panelists like sa Siliman, parang ganun, na iba na talaga yung sinusulat na fiction ng mga estudyante ngayon. And mayroong part sa akin na nostalgic, wow, parang tanda ko naman. In the sense na pag binabalikan ko yung mga sinulat, halimbawa nung co-fellows ko ng mga workshop 2016, 2017, which is not a long time ago, iba na talaga siya sa nababasa kong output ng mga estudyante. I think the insight there is just that it is evolving. Tapos, challenge siya ngayon sa teachers how to integrate certain interests of the students to keep you excited in their class. Pero sa akin kasi, importante pa rin that we kind of start the conversation with what happened before, what was written before. Kasi it's parte siya kung paano nag-evolve yung kung ano mang isekay na nangyayari sa mga binabasa ninyo. Parang may ganon din naman yata sa mga epics natin. Parang ganon yung mindset ko. So now I'm trying to find ways to connect the tradition with what you're writing. And sometimes I kind of sound like the Department of Tourism na ang ganda ng Pilipinas. But that's in earnest. Like talagang maganda kasi. Parang ako, I don't want you to miss out on that kind of writing. Nagiging joke na namin na para akong Greg Brillantes endorser. Pero parang binalikan namin siya recently somehow. Tapos ang ganda, sobrang ganda. Parang feeling ko, kung uupuan lang natin siya, makikita ninyo kung ano yung ginagawa niya also in what you love about what you're reading now. So it's a matter of trying to match these things that you like about all of these genres and trying to find ways how we can still talk about that while also talking about the tradition. Yun ba? Yun ba yung tanong na ano? Baka merong thoughts kayo as other teachers?
No, I welcome all of that kasi syempre, ano naman, di ba, ang gusto ko talaga mas open yung mga text. So parang pag sa classes ko, mas gusto ko nga yung mga estudyante na nagtitake ng risks. Parang ganon. Na meaning, to the point na pwedeng yung gagawin nila talaga, hindi ko pa na-encounter, wala ako, hindi ganun yung modern like lyric tradition. Nakita mo, ibang-iba na yung ginagawa nila. Pero kasi ako din, parang feeling ko, tinatry ko naman din talaga to move away from the modern lyric tradition. Pero like, halimbawa, yung mga preoccupations siguro, like siguro topical, like halimbawa, preoccupations ng mga students ko, I try to work with that, parang gano'n, di ba? So parang, how could, yung sinasabi mo na, hindi naman siguro, yung term kasi ni Fermin, tinanong din niya kung ano yung kung meron bang naiirita ba hindi naman irita, pero siguro iniisip ko lang yung, siguro, or iniisip ko lang or curious lang ako dun sa bakit may aversion ba talaga dun sa mga traditional na texts, di ba? Parang ganon. Na iniisip ko, technically, nasa ano pa rin talaga tayo, nasa academic setting, di ba? So inescapable, nasa school po tayo kasi. So inescapable kasi yung pag-engage with all of these, kasi siya may instructive, it doesn't matter kung gusto mo siya o hindi. May instructive purpose naman yung mga texts kung bakit, di ba? Parang gano'n. Minsan tinuturo ko din yung mga texts na hindi ko rin gusto, di ba? Kasi meron siyang pedagogical na purpose, halimbawa, di ba? So, inisip ko, I was thinking, sana makita rin ng students yung value no, why we're dealing with this. Like, okay, you wanna do an entire poetry collection about anime, halimbawa, di ba, ganon. Isa sa mga estudyante ko doing that, like, nandito ba si, pero sobrang interested ako sa project. Di ba? Kasi, hindi ko siya gagawin. Hindi ko siya gagawin, pero ang ganda maganda yung project. So, ako, I welcome all of that. Pero yun lang, minsan iniisip ko lang parang, sana din meron ding, hindi rin ganun ka-averse dun sa di ba, pag-engage dun sa entire range ng literary history, if you could call it that.
I maybe because we're all getting older, I actively fight the possibility that I'll end up being oh, these young people don't know. Parang active fighting against that yon. And how does that affect specifically curriculum or pedagogy, no? I can honestly say that I would say that over 2/3 of the books that influence This Is How were by authors that were introduced to me by students, for example. No? So I genuinely try to find an interest in what they like to read first. The class I'm teaching tonight, it's my 3rd year teaching it straight. No? So it's similarly outlined. No? The first 6 weeks, the readings are determined by the students. No? Because I genuinely want, because 6 weeks, for me, the first 6 weeks of discussing readings is like you're collaborating as a class to create that particular section's critical vocabulary on how to approach readings for the rest of the semester. That makes sense. So I use that as an opportunity, like, oh, sige nga, let's show me the poems that you like to read. Parang ganun. And then coupled with that is intentional sa akin ay some of the readings that come from me, intentionally on my part, are readings that I haven't actually read yet, but have always been meaning to read. Does that make sense? So as an instructor, I'm putting myself on the level of ground zero na rin. Na I want to discuss this work. I'm using the class to discuss it with my students, at which point they had already offered their own readings. So I guess that's how I respond and actively try to fight a kind of patronizing point of view by entertaining more my genuine interest in expanding my reading horizon. And knowing that my students read a lot, it just so happens they might not be reading the same stuff that I do. Edi okay. No? Para sa akin, hindi okay. No? Granted, not all my classes are that way, but I'm speaking specifically in poetry classes that I teach. Ganun yung approach ko. Yun. So trying to genuinely be interested in where they're coming from. Pero I will say my pet peeve, pwede ba pet peeve? Yung word na just, not just as in short for justice, no? But like when you bring up, a student might bring up a work that they like, but it's kind of reactionary to the perceived complicatedness of a work that I like. So they start discussing it on the level of actually underselling the work that they like. Na parang, gusto ko to, because it's just that. Medyo pet peeve ko yan. Balik ako sa one big message ko. Like, no, let's try to take this seriously. Now, why is this blowing your mind right now? Maybe it's just that, pero parang implicitly creating a hierarchy na mas mababang uri to or mas accessible to, parang medyo pet peeve ko ata siya. No? So in my class, when someone says just, parang mas gusto ko justice, ha? Pero yung kung just na parang ina-undersell or sinasimplify, parang gusto ko siya problemahin. Na parang what if there was something actually inherently brilliant here, na hindi lang siya more accessible, more fun, the typical defense mechanisms of pleasure. No? Yan. Okay.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Jill. Given what you mentioned about the canons, about the market, about the differing trends right now, how do you maintain your voice, your creative voice in writing? Yung boses nyo pa rin yung naririnig, despite of what the publisher will say is marketable, despite of what the canons say is parang the gold standard. Yun po. Thank you.
I think siguro nung mas medyo mas bata pa ako, mas kaya pa ako masway siguro ng anyway. Pero hindi to yung tipong yabang lang na parang hindi na ako masasway. Hindi siya ganun de. Ano siya, parang, clear kasi sa akin yung gusto kong mangyari sa bawat project. Like, halimbawa, sabihin ko yung first book ko din, ano rin yun parang medyo may pagka-hodgepodge din siya, no? Different things, different topics, different styles. Although meron naman siyang general na let's say, arc, but it's not like this book, and yung mga iniisip ko na project. So parang, feeling ko din, meron ding time na, I don't know, may experience din kasi ako na medyo, if you're writing a type of poetry, na yun nga, katulad ng sabi ni Martin, yung parang, kasi meron tayong, mas nag-gravitate tayo towards works that are easier to read, parang ganon. So may assumption parang, okay, pag nung susulat ka ng difficult poetry, hindi ka babasahin, parang ganon. Siguro relevant sa akin yung question na yun, dun sa punto na yun, because for the longest time, pag dinidescribe na difficult yung poetry ko, hindi ko alam how to feel about that. Parang ganun. So, parang worried ba ako na yung implication nun is wala magbabasa sa akin because it's difficult. Right? Hindi siya easy reading, parang ganun, di ba? But also, what does that mean? Yung difficulty nung work, di ba? Parang ganun. Yung perceived na difficulty ng work. Okay? So, ibig ba sabihin nun, we're saying that audiences can only take so much, ito lang yung level na kaya nila, which actually also is problematic for me na parang, okay, so, wala din tayong trust sa readers natin, parang ganun. So, that's why, siguro mahirap din yun, because I feel like certain institutions would sort of want you to comply with, yun nga, particular things like marketability or, di ba? Or particular topics of interest, di ba? Na posibleng mas palatable or whatever. Pero sa akin kasi, parang na ako doon, dahil clear sa akin, na-reconcile ko na rin yun, na parang siguro, ayoko magsalita ng tapos, hindi ko sure kung magbabago yung style ko in the next decades. Pero sa ngayon, clear sa akin kung ano yung direction ko, and also okay lang din sa akin kahit na some people parang label my poetry difficult. I don't know what to do with that, pero parang I'm still going to do it. Kahit na let's say maapektuhan yung marketability ng work, meaning even if people won't read my work just because of that thing, di ba? Parang ganun. So, kasi ano yun yung sinasabi nga ni Martin na parang, pag sinabi naman, I like this work just because it is, di ba? Parang ganun. So, ibig sabihin, dun lang sa level na yun. We're not engaging with it. Kasi marami namang mga poetry na parang madali. Like, I don't know, yung perceived na madali even during their time, like, images, poetry, di ba? Like, some people will say na parang, madali lang William Carlos Williams. Pero actually, hindi siya, medyo complex siya basahin yung mga works niya. Parang hindi rin marali yung images in the first place. Pero dahil it's just that, it seems like it's just that, we're not taking it seriously, parang ganun. So, interesado ako doon. Pero sa akin, klaro sa akin kasi kung ano yung gusto kong gawin. So, I am able to keep my voice, because yun nga, na meron na akong mga plano. Alam mo yun, meron na akong mga plano, mga project. Alam ko yung mga project ko would need this particular sort of voice and this particular kind of language, even if it's labeled as difficult by other people. So yun.
Thank you for the question. Dalawang sagot, no? Yung unang sagot, sa tingin ko, ay related siya sa sagot ni Pastrana kanina tungkol sa tanong na rejection. No? So, rejected by who? Like a publisher, di ba? Parang gano'n, no? Baka yung thing doon ay hindi divorced yung, wag naman hindi divorced, pero yung idea na sa dami ng avenues na pwede siya mag-encounter ng isang reader, parang hindi na nga siya problema eh, di ba? Parang sige, baka hindi para sa... Charlie talks about the manuscript that was rejected by another publisher, then you just submit it to someone else and it get published. Di ba? Parang ganun siguro yung simple answer doon in a very practical sense. Di ba? Parang baka it's just not for that community of practice, so to speak. Pero gusto ko yung, though I'm uncomfortable with the term, pero yung idea ng canon, no? Tapos, this is organized by the Literary and Cultural Studies program. We're from the Creative Writing program. No? Yung favorite parang phrase ni Kaisa, sorry, inside story, inside joke namin, parang book tour to eh, kasi parang tatlong kaibigan. Anyways, yung gusto ko yung term ni Kaisa minsan, when we revisit the projects that we create under the premise of earning a degree, we're actually burdened with questions like, how is this adding to Philippine literature? No? Nasa totoo lang, I don't think I would think that way if I wasn't asked to think that way for the purposes of creating something for the degree. Does that make sense? Parang buhay yung reading life ko, and I'm just conversing with the readings that I'm reading. No? So that's my personal response to the whole canon thing. I don't feel burdened by it at all, precisely because the last time I've been posed the question and made to answer the question very intelligibly was during a thesis defense when I earned my MFA, which is not the terms that I created projects after that, and it's not the terms that sustain my practice, earning degrees. It's not. No? So in a weird way, that kind of requirement to contextualize your project amid the bigger picture, it's almost perhaps the novelty of studying in a creative writing setup, in terms of being accountable for your answer. No? But otherwise, you're just left to your own sort of devices, no? In terms of determining the terms that you want this work to proceed with. No? And I think there's a certain freedom there that I don't feel I need to let go of, because that's the reality. No? Unless I go back to school, I won't be asked those kinds of questions. Unless I'm invited to a fucking talk like this, di ba? And then Francis asks it, di ba? Parang freedom na joyful yung enterprise sa akin. Okay. Yeah.
Correct. Yun na lang. Siguro to add, since, again, the book was part of a thesis, during my defense, one of my critics mentioned, what if short stories na lang to, Kaisa? Kasi the origin of the idea for me was a Western novel, Anagrams by Lori Moore. Yun yung inspiration ko why I wanted to do this. But then the gap was, how does that work for this kind of project na nandito nga sa local na setting? So I think they were trying to find a connection. And I was like, sabi nga ni Mojares, diba, syncretic novel, iba-ibang origins. And I think that can be reflected in the project. So I guess that's my response, in that, in a way, kind of integrates what has been written before and has been said about the tradition versus what I wanted to do. Although, part din nun nga ay yung conceit mo as a student na, this is what I want to do. I'm calling this a novel, period. Pero, meron pa rin siyang pwedeng theoretical na basis, parang ganun. So, I guess that's just coming in the, as a response to how you can parang back your choices. This is what I want to do. May isa pang ganung moment dito na merong mga explicit na sexual scenes sa libro. And I think challenge yun. Kasi kung titignan mo ang mga nobela ng mga babae in English, bihira na merong ganung moment. Madalas lalaki yung nagsusulat ng talagang erotic na eksena. And they kind of wanted that out of the book. But I'm like, pero mga tao tong character ko, malamang merong parte ng constitution nila yung desire. So yung ganun din, just, I think in my head, same kay Alan na, I knew what I wanted to do and I knew who these people are in the book. And I knew what kind of framework I needed to tell their story in a sense that would sound true to me as well. Parang ganun.
We're widening down the discussion, but I'm seeing one last question from the audience.
Hi. I'm Carissa. As a fellow creative writing teacher, and I think this is my opportunity to ask. I think implicit in this, kind of conference on, writing down the promise of influence is the promise of publication, right? And the idea that the book and the creative writing students are, tasked to have this milestone at the very end, which is to create the chapbook, right? Implicit in that is that the promise of publication as this very final form that I think, in fact, in a lot of ways implicates everything that we were talking about earlier, you were talking about earlier on institutionalization, from academic publication to literary publication, and its and how it constructs, diba, what we actually feel now, both in the enchantments but also the pressures, diba, of what we're calling the market. And so as teachers, I'm curious about how do you complicate and or expand the promise of publication for each other beyond, let's say, this final work of the book, harking back to, I think, a root word of publication, which is to make something public, to engage in a public domain. So what are your thoughts on that? Thanks.
One more time, Carissa, no? In the question, as teachers, how do we encourage or problematize the idea of publication, i.e. book, as the final endpoint, no? Well, I guess in our case, for an undergraduate setup, but generally, di ba, parang it seems like the book is the end point, no? So the question is, from the context of a teacher, how do you problematize that? No? Tama ba? No. Or as an author ba? Well, I like using the word writing practice a lot. Because if you view it as a practice, it means that the outputs that come out of the practice are a part of it, but aren't the end-all be-all of it. No? I also like thinking about how even one's writerly persona should not be overly romanticized, no? Insofar as the writing practice is part of the larger life and social practice. No? It is just one of the terms with which I engage civically in the world. No? And the difficulty of that kind of thinking, oftentimes for me in a reflective stance, is this idea of there's a tendency for us maybe to want to be very consistent in all our decisions. And I just found it to be very difficult to fall into the trap of litigating every decision such that it maintains a kind of consistency. So para sa akin, everything is a form of both resistance and complicity. And part of my resistance in terms of how I position my writing practice is I take it very seriously, but don't let it get in the way of laughing at yourself and therefore possibly viewing it as what it really is, which is limited. Does that make sense? We don't have to write, period. I guess that's it. No, we don't have to write. But the fact that I choose to implicitly embeds itself self-imposed responsibilities, to connect it to the earlier thing. No? I can choose not to care about other books, but I can't live with myself if I don't care about what other books have said while I'm writing mine. The master's program disallowed me of that, but embedded na in my thinking is that I disallow myself of that. Does that make sense? By the same token, I think I would prefer to have dinner with all of you all than continue this conversation for 5 more hours. Does that make sense? Parang pwede rin let's hang out. You get my point? Na parang, so it's so important, but it's not the most important thing. So it's a kind of tempering of writing so that it can maintain a significance that can too easily be co-opted by traditional measures of significance or conventional measures of significance in a world that is currently in peril of being deluded by enter your buzzwords. That makes sense? In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Uy, Nico Vitog is here. Oh my God. No, CW, second batch ever yan. Okay, ayan. I hope that answers your question, Carissa. No? Okay na? Ikaw, Francis.
Okay, so we're not finished yet. I'll turn you over now to our host, Luisa Gomez. We would like to acknowledge that we have visitors. We have students from Letran who's joining us. So welcome very much to our festival and to Ateneo de Manila.
Okay, see you. Okay. So thank you for that wonderful exchange. I'm here to introduce the student who will close the program. She is a representative of one of the organizers of this 3-day literary festival. Her name is Francesca Abalos, and she will deliver a message for everyone, and kindly stay seated and listen. Thank you.
You don't have to stay seated if you have a class, by the way. Don't listen to Ma'am Luisa. So I'll begin. Most of you do not know me, which is very much by design. However, as I'm going to close this event with curated reflections on my own experiences as a writer, it only makes sense to begin with an introduction. Hello, how do you do? I'm Francesca Abalos, a fourth-year student of the AB Literature English major under the LCSP, and the Deputy for Academic Affairs of the LCSP student arm, PLUME. More pointedly, however, I am a feature staffer of the university's official student publication, The Guidon, a responsibility that I am proud and honored to have. Despite this pride, I have to admit that there is very little glory or money in journalism. I don't think this should come as a surprise to you. It was not a shock to me, especially since every conversation I've had with a veteran journalist has always come to this conclusion. After all, we write stories about everyday realities and people that you may or may not read. We go out into the world to observe and document someone's struggles, sorrows, successes, and joys, most of the time out of our own pocket. We fight in narrative and representation for systemic transformation that, more often than not, we never see, or, like many of the largest names in the field, are condemned for. Veneration is rare, and money is rarer still. I apologize for being pessimistic, but this is just what the job is like. There are days when I wonder why I even want to continue doing this kind of writing. Why be a journalist after graduating? Why write when the after effects of a story are never guaranteed? Certainty is always reassuring, and this career offers none. When I leave an informal settlement after a day-long conversation with one of their community leaders, this same place still faces demolitions that displace residents for land development, even after the release of my article highlighting alternatives to this destruction. Once I say goodbye to the street dweller who regaled me with stories about the cats and dogs he carries around in his cariton, he disappears without any passers-by caring, and I never see him again. Even if I give interviewee compensation to the street cleaners who let me sit in their resting place, I know they will still struggle to make ends meet next month. More upsetting still is the realization that these are not the narratives my audience particularly cares to see or engage with. Since I am, of course, a student, I refer to the Ateneo readership. They want to read about experiences more reflective of their own lives, private schools, religion, love, and other such things. Stories about the university and its students always go the most viral. I don't say this maliciously since I am guilty of the same kind of selective reading. But this is the reality of writing and publishing, regardless of whether you are a journalist, poet, or a novelist. What we care about may not capture the interest of others. As such, I find myself constantly asking, how do you not feel helpless when confronted with these facts? How do you face the disappointment of writing to push for social justice only for your words to change little to nothing? I don't think I have an answer to these questions for myself, let alone for you, but my message is not trying to offer concrete reassurances anyway. As a campus journalist, writing meant surrendering any delusions that I can directly control my effect on the world. It was humbling, but it was also so painful. I never know what impact my stories will have, how many people they will reach, or the kind of audience they will find. Sometimes I don't even know if they'll make it into circulation. I just have to live with that and keep going anyway. I continue to write about people left on the margins of Philippine society, even if my stories do not speedily change their conditions and readers do not notice the piece. I keep fighting. I say this because if it doesn't yet, it will feel like a battle, no matter the exhaustion, frustration, and outright depression that inevitably arises. Our careers as journalists and writers are founded in uncertainty because the truth of the matter is, at least in my journalistic experience, the stories we write are never for the present or even for the past, but for the future. This is, of course, contradictory to the journalistic value of timeliness that places precedent on immediacy. But it is, to me, a more honest assessment of what we do. We write about the injustices faced by people day, not because our works will render instantaneous results. And we address past oppressions and social issues not because they holistically reconstruct the past. No. We continue on our journeys as writers in the hopes that we have created a large, truthful, and meaningful archive that will inform a better future, whether we or those we write about live to see it or not. The audacious existence of our material ensures that certain experiences and lives are not lost in the tomorrows yet to come, but add to these possibilities construction. Sadly, given the way of the world, it is more likely than not that the people, places, things, and creatures we document will be destroyed before anything significant comes to fruition. Our influence, as such, can never be fully in our hands. The stories we write bridge the chasms in our society's memories, perceptions, and systems, but can never fill these gaps entirely. Our work, after all, is intangible, which makes it easy to succumb to this concept's inherent helplessness. However, this is only when we forget that the stories we make are never solely ours, that we are not alone once the narrative has left our hands. Yes, we can only do so much at the individual level we maintain as writers, but those who view and find value in the works we generate have the potential to bring about the change our pieces champion. We, as journalists and writers, will never have the reassurance of the concrete, but we type away in these thankless, unpredictable jobs because, hopefully, we will have written something that motivates others to address the social inequalities and cruelties our stories have exposed. At the end of it all, we can only hope we have done and written enough.
Thank you, Chas. Thank you once again for participating in the third session of the 3-day Ateneo Literary and Cultural Festival. Later, we will have a session on queer art forms, so please join us at the Natividad Galang Fajardo Room at De La Costa Hall. I'd also like to invite everyone that we have a book fair. It's near Rizal Library, and the books of the authors featured today are also available there. Hope you can drop by and visit. There are other publishers there also featuring their merchandise. Okay? I'll see you again perhaps soon. We also have one last thing, a culminating activity tomorrow, starting at 1:00 p.m. at the MVP roof deck. What will happen tomorrow is that there will be bands, open mic, poetry readings, and we'd like to invite the Ateneo community, visitors, just register so that you can engage more fully with the experience of exchange discourse about literature, culture, and everything in between. Again, my name is Luisa Gomez. I'm very thankful for your participation this morning. A round of applause again for our panelists. Okay, thank you. Okay, this ends our morning session for the second day. Thank you all and hope you have a happy lunch. Bye. Bye. Bye, thank you.
The newly created Literary and Cultural Studies program, LCSP, launches this festival in coordination with the following: Rizal Library, Ateneo de Manila University Press, Kritika Kultura, and PLUME. The ALCF gathers the university community, book publishers, local writers, literary enthusiasts, thought leaders, and cultural entrepreneurs to promote literacy and explore untapped opportunities for innovation and enterprise in the creative industries in the country and beyond. This festival highlights emerging and established writers while fostering intellectual discourse, cultural exchange, creative enterprise, and literary excellence. It offers insights into the Philippine publishing industry, provides advice to aspiring authors, and promotes discussions on literature's role in bridging cultural divides, especially in LGBTQIA+ issues. In doing so, the ALCF provides a safe laboratory for bold intellectual experimentation, innovative thinking, and new synergy between scholarly communities and the creative industries. So this lecture aims to promote inclusivity through queer art forms. The ALCF will provide a safe space to queer writers to speak about their experiences and creative processes, highlighting the significance of representation and challenging dominant norms in literature, art, and ethnography. These discussions emphasize LCSP's commitment to inclusivity and fostering dialogues on identity, marginalization, and artistic creation. Now, to officially kickstart the event, let's hear a few introductory remarks from the Director of the Literary and Cultural Studies program. Everyone, let's welcome Dr. Charlie Samuya Very.
I'm actually not aware that I'm supposed to provide an introductory remark, but I'll do it just the same. Welcome, everyone. This is a total hit. We had to send away some students who wanted to get in, and this promises to be an incredible session. We have writers, artists, and ethnographers, as well as critics who will be talking about their creative practices and the ways in which queerness shapes those same practices. So welcome everyone to the Ateneo. This is a safe space, and we want to enable that kind of space for creativity to flourish. Thank you very much, and welcome again.
Thank you, Dr. Varick, for doing the opening remarks, even though you weren't informed that you were going to do the opening remarks. Thank you again. So, ayon, now I would like to call on the moderator of the session as well as a beloved professor of mine. Everyone, she will be the one introducing this event's panelists, Ma'am Maria Gabriela Martin.
Thank you, Jana. So welcome to the last session of the first Ateneo Literary and Cultural Festival, doing queer art forms. My name is Mayel Martin, and I will serve as the moderator for this panel. So you'll be hearing presentations from Mark Anthony Kayanan, Hide van der Waal, Aaron Philip M. de la Cruz, and Isola Tong on their experiences and creative processes as queer artists and critics that highlight the significance of representation in challenging dominant norms in literature, art, and ethnography. So allow me to introduce our first speaker. Mark obtained an MFA from the University of Wisconsin in Madison and a PhD from the University of Adelaide, where they received the 2021 Doctoral Research Medal. They are the author of the poetry books Narcissus, released by ADMO Press, and Except You Enthrall Me by UP Press. Forthcoming titles include the Philippine edition of Un Animal, Counterfeit Scurrilous, originally published in Australia by Giramondo Publishing, and to be released in late 2024 by the University of Santo Tomas Publishing House, as well as Miracle Fever, which will be published by the Northwestern University Press in 2026. A recent postdoctoral fellow at the ICI, Berlin Institute for Cultural Inquiry, Kayanan currently teaches at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Everyone, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Kayanan.
Thanks, Mael. Hi, everyone, I guess. Yeah. Sure. All right. Well, I mean, I've been asked to talk about queer art forms in relation to our own creative practice. So just like indulge me a bit because I'm going to be kind of quasi self-absorbed. I'm going to talk about my work. I'm going to talk about the writers who've also influenced me. Right. And it's wonderful that like Charlie kind of homed in on the idea of this being a safe space because that's pretty much going to be my jumping off point for I guess the quasi lecture I'm going to be giving today. Yeah. For me, the word queer in queer art forms, queer as a modifier, queer in a pejorative sense as a disclaimer, or queer as a hermeneutic lens as a procedure for interpretation, is important as an indicator not just of formal idiosyncratic moves in any given work, or of transgressions across generic boundaries, but, of course, of a reality, a mode of existence, often fraught, that's been inhabited and felt. It's not just a description of a project or a formal procedure, an aesthetic inclination, but most pressingly, a signifier of how art, or literature in my case, can transmute a lived condition of otherness, or of the survival-oriented elasticity of identity. My first love as a poet was John Keats, slide please, whose works I first encountered when I was 12 years old, I think. I read The Eve of St. Agnes and felt the poem, its descriptions of cold and of amorous moves, before completely understanding what was going on. Keats's poetry is known for its linguistic excess. Sensuous is a word often attached to assessments of his writings, especially when compared with the oeuvre of contemporaries like Shelley and Byron, whose poems were decidedly temperate in their imagery and arguably more rhetorical than descriptive. To be more specific, Keats came or rose from the working class at a time when most well-regarded poets had a more affluent lineage. Keats, says Narcessian, skimmed the proletarian perimeter while being aspirationally shabby genteel, a fanciful, dreaming tea drinker with a false claim on respectability. The reviews of Keats's work were reductive, of course. and unfairly spiteful. Narcissian further states, next slide, please. There you go. Narcissian further states that reviewers in his time called his poetry puerile and effeminate, unhealthy and unclean. And Wordsworth once sniffed, "There is no such unhealthy lusciousness." Lord Byron agreed. Such poetry, he declared, is a sort of mental masturbation. And elsewhere, Byron snickers about Johnny Keats's piss-a-bed poetry. However, when I read Narcissian's book, a tribute to Keats's great odes, and came upon this catalog of abysmal, disheartening, and super cruel reviews, for good or ill, I thought, of course, it made a whole lot of sense. It was tempting for me as a fan to think of how Keats channeled, through his poetry, not just social, but also romantic, also even control, or sorry, like for social mobility. Let me say that again. It was tempting for me as a fan to think of how Keats channeled through his poetry his aspirations for social mobility, for the acquisition of stature and of control, not just social, but also romantic, also even control over death. Keats was, next slide, based on every account I read, not queer. He wasn't gay. But it was important for me to know that Keats treated his poetry as a haven, a sanctuary made up of words he could retreat into, where he could contrive and lay claim to a fantastic world whose removed from reality, from, as Keats puts it in Ode to a Nightingale, the weariness, the fever, and the fret, was as close to true as a writer could. That same sentiment may be said about Jean Genet, another favorite writer back when I was younger. Slide, please. Genet's most well-known work, Our Lady of the Flowers, was an autofictional world of drag queens and pimps, written when Genet was in prison. The novel was famously referred to by Jean-Paul Sartre as the epic of masturbation. Sartre, in describing Genet's feverish immersion in his visions, accounts for the appeal of Genet's hyper-stylized, over-aestheticized world. According to Sartre, aestheticism does not derive from an unconditional love of the beautiful. It is born of resentment. Those whom society has placed in the background, the adolescent, the woman, the homosexual, subtly attempt to reject a world which rejects them and to perpetrate symbolically the murder of mankind. It's a pretty extreme quote, but it's a good point of origin for me to express what I think of in light of the notion of queer art forms, especially as regards my own creative practice. When I first began to think of what it meant to write in a queer way, or to transpose my queerness into matters of form, one readily available idea presented to me had to do with the links between queerness and the impulse toward experimentalism. Slide, please. Something akin to Nikki Sullivan's designation of the gerund queering as making strange, frustrating, counteracting, delegitimizing, and camping up. But that idea felt incomplete to me, especially given my devotion to the lyric poem. So I thought maybe, slide please, the lyric to me is a queer art form. And I consider it as such, primarily because I find in it the possibility of a safe space, a somehow habitable, almost masterable space. And I'm using the word masterable and I'm borrowing from Carl Phillips. Which is not to say that a queer form precludes experimentalism or the ability to take formal risks. In fact, the notion of a safe space is precisely contingent upon the immanence of risk, as well as a desire to, if only fleetingly, to bypass it, if not to surpass it. The queer safe space, then, as a survival mechanism. The casting of the lyric as queer space, as queer safe space, derives from how, in my creative practice, I've made attempts to turn the lyric into a linguistic environment where I am allowed, or to be more precise, in which I allow myself to test a version of a self, or versions of selves I can stand by, and to find through it alternative models of sociality and solidarity, not the kind constrained by the real world, whose demands upon the queer subject continue to be less than compassionate. I attempt to make the lyric a safe space through the use of elisions or omissions, a rhetorical tendency I absorbed from reading Hart Crane, another favorite poet whose works continue to disconcert me. Crane is a pretty obscure poet, and his obscurity is a characteristic that's been read by queer theorists as a strategic retreat into epistemological privacy, which is to say his poetry can shut you out as a reader if you're not too privy to gay codes. Slide. Thomas Yingling cites Crane as an exemplar of how, among gay writers, literature is less a matter of self-expression and more a matter of coding, making homosexuality a mode of semiotic expression. Queer coding then, in Crane's poems, occurs when homosexuality becomes textually obscure, hidden in a multitude of oblique references that encode it as the authorizing secret of the text. For Crane, the safe space is a private space, one which preserves a life by putting it in code, a refusal as much as it is a private invitation to the sympathetic reader. Let me say that clearly for emphasis. I may not exactly want to, as Sartre puts it, perpetrate the murder of mankind, but I wholeheartedly believe in occlusions, in omissions. I believe in lyric refusals. The most recent project I worked on is Miracle Fever, a book of poems revolving around Marian apparitions that took place in Agoo, La Union, from 1989 to 1993. The apparitions revolved around the controversial figure of Judiel Nieva, the then prepubescent visionary who spoke with the Virgin Mary and allegedly performed miracles. In 2003, nearly a decade after the Catholic Church deemed the apparitions inauthentic, Nieva would decide to claim public control over her gender identity. While on a media blitz to promote her role in the film Sitlo, as a woman having an affair with her neighbor, Nieva would openly discuss her transition, at one point stating, "Ito ang kagustuhan ng mahal na birhen." However, my book, as much as it is about Nieva and her apparitions, is also fixated upon the haphazardly collective psyche of the town and the devotees. I wrote a huge chunk of the project while on a postdoctoral fellowship in Berlin. I'm also the kind of writer who tries to publish regularly in lit mags and journals outside the country as a way of circumventing the naughty tendency of local literary communities toward patronage and nepotism. So, working on Miracle Fever, which was securely based on Philippine material, I knew how easy it was for my project to be read as an exoticist production of otherness and co-opted within the global machinery of cultural commodification, a structure that, according to Graham Huggan, many post-colonial scholars, and by extension artistic practitioners, find themselves enmeshed in or are compelled to build their cachet from. Coding, as practiced by Hart Crane for me, served then as a way to proceed in as ethical a manner as possible. But instead of coding intimate personal details, I chose to partially circumvent exposition and potentially culturally reductive because readily legible information. To my mind, coding, as deployed in the lyric, was a way of rerouting, perhaps even minimizing, possible gains from my complicity as a writer whose practices and institutional involvement are unavoidably mercenary. In this sense, the lyric's ability to rein in my and my work's potential for commodification and this capacity to accommodate cultural irreconcilabilities are, to me, strong signifiers of its evolving status as queer safe space. So yeah, I maybe have a few more things to say about the queer lyric, but for the sake of time, I figured maybe one good way to kind of wrap this up is to just read a poem from the project. Measurable orders. Inside every town is the myth they agree to inhabit. They don't have to believe it. They've learned enough to make nothing of their suspicions. Inside every myth is its enterprising teller, light source around which revolve the story's frantic wings. Inside the life source is the story of the story is a body noosed with time. Inside the prodigal body is an archive of chronic behavior, generations picking at their scabs, spitting out the red cud. Though no one admits it, they've raised more rebels in the town than priests. They require that their children scamper up the apparition hill, talk the faithful into buying cardboard fans, rosaries that turn golden from the fever of belief. Inside every belief is a question. Inside every unasked question is the weight between hope and reward, interminable. Inside every reward is the unreticent hunger. Those who have traveled from the capital wave their white handkerchiefs when blue specters from the heavens gratify their patience. Afterward, the fragrance of a million jasmines, morning pure, message sure. They breathe it in and postpone their hunger. Inside every hunger is a congregation of tiny, impetuous hungers. Inside every congregation is music and sweat, and blessed are the poor in spirit, they shall people the eternal kingdom. The local orchestra plays at the plaza, and the dictator's a saint they invoke at the new church, rebuilt after the quake. Inside every church is a better church, where no one is untrue, and God is all the versions they've favored. He knows the cruelty of his long neglect, times his apologies with the collapse of their lives. Inside every life is a boy throwing another tantrum. Inside every boy, tucking his hair into a good morning towel, is the glorious adult. When he sticks out his tongue for the divine gift, he finds salvation from the life within which she's clenched. The prophet offers prayers to the future, which speaks back with a clear, knowable alto. Could the future be a thwartable sentence? The prophet makes an unstartled face. Inside this face rises the promised face, so gorgeous we prize mercy out of it. Must we forgive each other ourselves to be true to it? Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for allowing us to take an inside look, okay, at your poetics. Okay. Our next speaker is Hide van der Waal. Hide teaches in the Department of Fine Arts and the Literary and Cultural Studies program here in Ateneo. He studied history in Amsterdam and Berlin before doing his PhD in German Cultural Studies at the University of Nottingham. He has since moved his focus to Philippine literary and cultural studies. He teaches classes on art studies, art history, queer literature, and queer art. Everyone, let's welcome Hide van der Waal.
Right. Thank you for that. It's a bit higher. Hello. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. I was asked also to say something about doing queer art forms from my practice. I'm not an artist. I am just a teacher. But I will just, some of you know already how I do it, right? I see some familiar faces here. Anyway, let's get going. Next slide, please. I like the title of this session, Doing Queer Art Practices, or something like that, because this is one of the favorite memes I always show to my students in the first day of Art of the Queer classes. Queerness is a thing you do, right? It's a constant practice that we, or some of us, most of us maybe, do every day. It's something that is practical, that is performed, hence the Saint Jude there, Judith Butler in that picture, right? Thanks. Next slide, please. So what does queer mean to me as an academic? It's a perspective more than an identity that I perform. It's also a perspective that I use whenever I teach, not just when I teach my queer art classes, but when I teach other classes, when I do research as well. A collection, a very wide collection, sometimes a very incoherent collection of critical views, but what they have in common is they challenge the norms of gender and sexuality that we are all familiar with, but connected to that, any norm that governs our lives. And what queer theory does for me is show that these norms of sexuality and gender, they permeate almost every aspect of society, from something as simple as teaching, which is kind of a patriarchal thing to do, right, all the way to how our nations, how are they organized, and that they even exist. Anyway, that is what queerness would mean to me. So one of my favorite theorists is Jose Esteban Munoz, who in Queer Utopia describes queerness as a great refusal. A refusal of what he calls the performance principle. In our modern life, by the way, performance here means something slightly different from Judith Butler. Judith Butler is genders are performed, identities are performed here. The performance principle borrowed from Herbert Marcuse. Sorry, here's my German studies major, showing through Herbert Marcuse in Eros and Civilization, wrote that our current society is focused so much on performing certain roles, certain functions, that we lost track of two other principles, namely the pleasure principle and the reality principle. We're not fostering real connections anymore with other people, with the world around us, and we're also losing track of just having fun, enjoying ourselves, have pleasurable experiences. Right, so queerness is for Munoz the great refusal. This, as I said earlier, this goes beyond sexuality and gender, but it necessarily include that. For me, there's a wonderful chapter in Munoz, which I don't know if I can say it because we're on YouTube also, but there's an F word in there. It's a quote, right? So the title is Fucking Keith, Discovering Utopia, wherein the poet John Giorno is quoted, who writes a poem about how he has an intimate encounter with a young man who later turns out to be Keith Haring, who during the deed he finds his sense of utopia in this world. Queerness, queer acts, queer performance, it allows us to find better worlds in so many ways. So a great refusal of how we're supposed to be, what we're supposed to do, and a refusal of what is seen as normal, as quote unquote correct, as natural as well. Next slide, please. Another key thinker who influences my teaching is Jack Halberstam, with the queer art of failure, where failure is conceived of as something that is not necessarily wrong. Maybe failure can be a good thing, because what is failure is failing to meet those norms, right? Sorry. The images, by the way, are images that I also take from my Art of the Queer class. Shameless plug that it will be offered again next semester. Can we go back to the previous one? Right, because I think this really shows nicely that refusal to comply. It's a kind of collage by a Filipino-American artist called Mark Agujar. They entitled it No Top Needed. And here you can see what happens when all the norms of even how to be queer, how to be gay are being subverted, and even norms of how to represent a body, right? Just by cut out paper, how beautiful is that? So if we refuse those norms, we can come up with wonderfully new perspectives on the world. Next slide, please. Hauersam also thinks of queerness as subverting our ways of experiencing time and space. So there's a queering of temporality and spatiality as well in the wonderful title, In a Queer Time and Place. Hi. So what happens, what this implies is that heteronormativity imposes timelines on us, right? You get born, you go to grade school, high school, college, where you have some time to mess around, right? But after college, you have to get serious, get married, and so on. That's the timeline that we're on. And our spaces are also very much defined by this thing. Look how much space in Metro Manila is reserved for family homes, for example, right? Car centricism is a great example. What is a car? It's a family thing. It's something where you transport your family with, right? Here you see a work by an American artist called Omar Mismar. It's called The Path of Love, done in 2014. Wonderful sort of neon shape, but how is this shape created? Mismar took his phone out, went on Grindr, found a hot guy, tried to come as close as possible and just stay as close as possible for an entire day. He also has then a tracker on his Google Maps or however that went, and the shape that created on the map is then turned into a neon thing like this, kind of subverting how the map is something straight as well. Berland and Warner in sort of, this is the last one I want to mention, in a text called Sex in Public. They also talk about how urban space is very much straight space. And they go beyond that, saying that even the nation is conceived of as a heterosexual kind of family. They talk about national heterosexuality like that. Yes, next slide, please. So those are kind of my four holy grails of my of my uh, theoretical queer theory. So how does this manifest in my practice as a teacher? Some of you know that already. I think, you know, it's obviously I teach a class on queer literature, a class on queer art, but it shows throughout my practice, I think. I teach something for our majors in the Fine Arts Department, which is a Western art history course. From the Greeks all the way up to the end of the 19th century when a great artist, Vincent van Gogh, invents modern art, right? What can be more straight, more hetero, patriarchal than a queer, a Western art course? Next slide, please. Right? Great artists like Donatello. Or, next slide, Caravaggio. Look what's going on here. Is this gay? Of course it is. If it weren't, what would be, right? Next slide, please. So we can have Caravaggio paint. The previous one was him painting a pretty boy for a cardinal. This one is him painting himself as the severed head of Goliath, chopped off by a pretty boy who is supposedly David, right? But we also have an old man who is submitting here and being slain by a young who has his shoulder and his nipples showing, right? So everything is kind of obvious. Or am I being ahistorical here? The queer answer could be, does that matter? Right? Western art history generally is something definitely patriarchal. And it's good to know all these stories, but it's also healthy to subvert them. Next slide, please. To maybe take a hammer to the head of the patriarchy from time to time, right? So that we can maybe really love, next slide, Leonardo for who he really was. Look at how Leonardo paints or draws this model here, right? What I want to say here is that we can locate queer experiences through art in the past. We can locate them in art history. Not to necessarily claim that all of these artists are gay or queer or whatever, but to show that there are different ways of reading and seeing these things. Next slide, please. There's this concept which I got from Alex Pilcher, who wrote a wonderful little book, A Queer Little History of Art. Highly recommended, published by Tate Gallery, 2018, from the top of my head. An art gallery gaydar. We can't go through the gallery and just recognize something queer. This is something I took last year when I was in Paris in the Musée d'Orsay. And the title just is something like, it says there, Woman with an Umbrella, right? But I saw this woman and I saw something queer in how she was presented. Her face seems androgynous in a way. It can be me, obviously, the website of the Musée d'Orsay doesn't say anything about this possibly being a queer representation, but you know, coming from a culture that's saturated with RuPaul's Drag Race, I couldn't help but look at this in a certain way. And I think that that's a nice thing, right? What is the point of all these great artists from the past if we can't relate them to our own experiences? So it's both using art to locate the queer experience in the past, but also to make these artworks relatable to our lives right now. Sometimes we have to subvert the official meanings. We have to queer those meanings to come up with new stories, because it would be sad if there are only one story possible, right? Next slide. I think I have one more slide to go. Yes, so that's sort of how it shows in my teaching, or how I wanted to show in my teaching. In my research, very quickly, I'm working now on this image, which has been haunting me for a year now, or maybe 2 years already. Ever since I first came upon it, I was like, wow, this is an interesting image. It's by one of the most famous Dutch art photographers of the 20th century, Ed van der Elsken, and it's taken in Cebu in 1959. Docker near the passenger ship Sweet Life. Now, how does a queer Dutchman, Kabayan of this guy, in the 21st century, who lives in the Philippines, how does my identity make this work so interesting? I'm not entirely sure, but I think it has something to do with, you see the boy in the corner to the right, he is pointing at us. He's raising his eyebrows as if to protest the presence of the camera. We're supposed to think of this artist as a great artist, but there's also something problematic about going as a white dude with your camera in 1959 to some poor people in Cebu, taking the picture, bringing it home to Europe, and make a fantastic photo book out of it that sells and makes you famous until after your death. So that's how you can queer that kind of artist. I still love him. I grew up reading or browsing through photo books of this guy. So, Jon, not really a conclusion, but Jon, Mark had a poem. I have my Ed van der Elsken picture. Thank you very much.
That was an interesting demonstration of how queer can be a way of seeing. Thank you, Hide. Our third presenter is Miss Phil de la Cruz. Si Miss Phil de la Cruz ay isang trans feminine scholar na nagtuturo full-time sa pamantasang Ateneo de Manila. Kasama ng kagawaran ng Filipino, nagtuturo rin siya ng mga kurso sa social sciences at antropolohiya sa Universidad ng Pilipinas Diliman. Nagtapos siya ng magna cum laude sa degreeng AB Literature sa Universidad ng Santo Tomas para sa kanyang di-graduadong pag-aaral. Nagtapos naman siya ng masterado sa antropolohiya sa UP Diliman, kung saan ang kanyang thesis tungkol sa traditional at online na sabong ay ginawaran ng ika-4 na premyo sa pangatlong Loretta Macasiar Sikat Awards para sa mga natatanging pananaliksik ng social sciences. Nakatuon ang pananaliksik niya sa anthrozoology at mababasa ang mga akda niya sa agham tao, dunong at sa paparating na espesyal na issue ng journal ng ASLE ASEAN Eco-Criticism sa ilalim ng National University of Singapore. Bigyan natin ng palakpak si Miss Phil de la Cruz.
First of all, di ko alam kung bakit ako invited dito kasi clearly I'm a biological woman. Di ba? So bakit sa queer, di ba? Di ba? Okay, teka lang. Galing ako sa klase, so laban natin yan. Okay? So, okay, first of all, maraming salamat doon sa invitasyon. Lalo kay Sir Charlie, di ba? Nag-invite sa akin dito, kakalabas ko lang ng x-ray. Tapos, in-invite niya ako dito, sige, go na yan. Di ba? So ayun, hindi ko alam kung nakikita niyo akong palaboy-laboy dyan sa labas ng kagawaran ng Filipino, pero yes, nagtuturo siya ng mga kurso sa panitikan na nagturo din ako ng mga kurso sa last sem ng queer literature. Panitikang queer tungkol sa katawan ng mga baklita, ng queerness nga, di ba? Yung aking pagtatalakay ngayon ay tutuhugin niya, o di ba tuhog? Di ba? Tutuhugin niya ang pagkasabing-sabing ng aking personal na buhay, kasama din yung craft ko ng pagsulat ng etnografiya, pati yung aking double talaga bilang dancer lately, di ba? At pinamagatan ko nga itong pagpapaubaya sa Indayog na hinihiram ko yung terminong biomythography sa isa sa mga kamakailan ko lang nabasa na feminist writer na si Audre Lorde, di ba? Sa kanyang libro na Zami, ay sasabihin niya itong bagay na nag-resonate sa akin habang binabasa ito. At yung nasa parang pinakaunang pahina ata ng libro. Sasabihin niya na parang if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and be eaten alive. Di ba? Bakit may pangangailangan halimbawa sa ating mga queer people? Di ba? Taas nga yung kamay, charot lang. Mga queer people na parang ipaglaban talaga yung sarili natin, di ba? Na kanina pa nga nababanggit nung dalawa nating mga tagapagsalita, di ba? Muli, ito ay pagsasapin-sapin ng personal, academic, at creative life ko. So, medyo mimi siya, pero may punto tong lahat. Diba? So, alam ko na hindi na kayo bago doon sa konsepto na kapag usapin, halimbawa, ng isang bakla, na lumalaki lalo dito sa bansa natin na very heteronormatibo, ay maraming mga pag-a-adjust dun sa bodily choreographies na habang lumalaki tayo, di ba? Lalong-lalo na kung yung mga parents mo, unfortunately, at yung family mo ay homophobic nga, di ba? So, bilang pagbabahagi siguro nitong biomythography na ito ay isa ko doon sa mga unfortunate na mga tao na lumaki na laging parang pinapanday at binabantayan yung pagkilos ng aking katawan, di ba? Na para bang kada kibot ko, bata pa lamang ako, kailangan kong bantayan yung paraan ng pananalita ko, paraan ng pananamit ko, paraan ng paggalaw ko, di ba? Halimbawa, ilan sa mga maririnig ko ng bata ako ay makikita nyo doon sa harap, di ba? Na makikita mo talaga na parang may lagi nagbabantay sa iyo at yung sarili mong bahay na dapat ay ligtas na espasyo. Hindi mo nakikita yon na parang isang lugar kung saan pwede kang maging sarili mo. Kaya nga 'di ba ang tendency again, 'di ba nabanggit na rin naman yung drag race kanina at oversaturated na siguro tayo ng mga ganitong mga naratibo na lumalaki ka sa isang bahay at patago mo lagi na ginagawa halimbawa yung pagdadamit sa saya, hinanakaw mo yung duster nung nanay mo. Ginawa ko yun, be, 'di ba, nung college. At alam ko na again, parang ano na tayo dito, saturated na tayo dito sa bagay na ito. Pero gusto ko ipaalala sa inyo na realidad yon na maraming mga queer na tao sa bansa natin. Kaya ayun nga, parang lumalaki ka na parang laging binabantayan. Hindi ka lang binabantayan ng mga tao sa paligid mo, binabantayan mo rin ng sarili mo. Kasi nga, natatakot kang magkamali, natatakot kang malambot at malamya yung paraan ng pagtawa mo. Natatakot ka na mali yung paraan ng paglalakad mo. Natatakot ka na mali yung salita even na ginagamit mo. Na baka sabihin, ba, saan mo natutunan yan? Di ba? Bakit ba bakla-bakla ka? At marami pang iba, di ba? So yun, parang lumalaki tayo. O siguro parang yung mga queer na tao ay lumalaki sa isang lipunan nga na heteronormatibo at binabantayan lagi yung katawan. So much so na ikaw na rin mismo ay natututunan mo na bantayin yung sarili mong katawan at batay na nga rin sa teorya ni Butler, di ba? Dahil sa citationality at pagpaulit-ulit na yon ng mga bagay na dapat mong ginagawa. Minsan, nakakalimutan mo na magbigay at lumikha ng espasyo para kilalanin mo yung sarili mo. Kasi nga, again, wala kang ibang ginawa kung hindi patayin yung bahagi na ito ng sarili mo. At iniisip mo na yung sinasabi ng iba, yung identidad mo. Gets ba? At tatapitin ko kayo na sa pag-aaral ko ng anthropology, di ba? Sa UP at unang salta ko doon sa Universidad ng Pilipinas, napakahalagang bagay ito na lagi kong tinatandaan tungkol doon sa pagsasagawa ko ng ethnography, di ba? Lalong-lalo na sa, parang every sem nag-field work kami, pinapagod talaga kami ng professor namin, di ba? At sinasabi lagi at inidiin sa amin ng mga professor namin, si Professor Datar, si Professor Mario Mangahas, sasabihin nila na 85% halimbawa ng tagumpay ng isang etnografiya, at titira ka dun kasi for 2 to 3 weeks ay yung paghahanda mo ng lahat ng bagay. Para sa mga straight people at mga straight yung kaklase, yung paghahanda na pag tinatanggap nila yung salitang paghahanda na yon, iniisip lang nila siguro paghahanda ng mga damit na dadalhin mo, mga tubig, yung life insurance mo, di ba? Part yon, yes, ang requirement, di ba? Yung mga medical certificate. Pero para sa mga queer at mga bakla na taong katulad ko ay hindi lang yon yung paghahanda na kinakailangan na na parang i-ready ko. Kung hindi, pati kailangan kong paghandaan din kung paano ko ba haharapin itong mga tao na ito sa isang komunidad at hindi ako maging stand out kasi isang bagay din na tinuro sa amin sa etnografiya ay kailangan mo ngang makihalubilo. Di ba? Kailangan mo mag-blend in technically. Kasi yun yung isang paraan para makuha mo yung loob ng iyong informant tapos sila ngayon ay magiging komportable para magbahagi sa iyo ng iba't ibang mga datos. Kaya habang ginagawa ko yung iba't iba kong etnografiya, totoo talaga yung sinasabi ko sa inyo na parang yung bagay na tinuro sa akin habang lumalaki ako, ganon din yung uri ng pagbabantay na ginagawa ko sa sarili ko habang nandun ako sa kalagitnaan ng fieldwork at pinatapon kami dun sa Ifugao ng aming profesor. At syempre natakot ka rin kasi talaga na baka maging sanhi yung queerness mo, yung pagiging iba mo, di ba? Yung pagiging stand out mo doon sa pagkolekta mo ng datos, di ba? Tanda ko halimbawa na ilang beses kong ina-adjust yung boses ko, yung paraan nung paggalaw ko. Even as much as avoiding words like charot, yung mga ganon, Kerry. Totoo nga, I mean, nakakatawa siyang pag-isipan, pero bahagi talaga ito nung realidad ng isang queer na anthropologist na sinusubukan talagang suyurin, makiisa sa isang sa isang field work na ito. At lahat parang in my 5 years ng stay dito sa kurso na ito, napakahirap at nakakapagod noon. Isa sa mga pinakamahirap na hamon sa akin bilang isang queer na na academic at a scholar na nagsasagawa ng fieldwork ay nung nag-decide ako, at hindi ko rin alam bakit nag-decide ako na ang aralin ay sabungan. Di ba? Dahil ito yung mga panahon na may online sabong. Di ba? Ganda yung research ko. Anyway, yung paksa ko dito sa online sabong na ito ay yung siste o yung ideya o yung practice ng pagkikilatis. Meron ba sa inyong nakapanood na ng nagsasabong? Wala pa kasi po wala po kami doon sa mga ganung mga area, 'di ba? Pero doon sa doon sa sabong kasi, meron tayong ideya ng pagkikilatis. Ano yung pagkikilatis na 'yon? Pag isasali natin sa English, yung pagkikilatis ay isang uri ng pag-scrutinize, 'di ba? Pag-scrutinize, pag-analyze. Bakit? Kasi yung mga sabongero, kinikilatis, ini-scrutinize nila yung manok na sa tingin nila yung pinaka mahusay batay doon sa physical appearance niya. Hindi lamang doon nung paraan nung pagaspas niya wings niya, nung kanyang pakpak, pati yung kanyang yung leg na yan, meron yang term high station, low station, mid station, pati yung paraan ng paglakad at pagkaskas, yung pagkaskas doon sa gradas o yung arena, binabantayan yan ng mga sabongero. At napakahirap nun sa akin. Kasi nagigets nyo ba yung paralelismo na parang itong ang hayop na ito ay grabe yung pagbantay nila. Diba? What more akong nakikita nyo naman kung paano ako magsalita, diba? Parang papasok dito sa mga espasyo na to na very hypermasculine, diba? Mga mama talaga. Ano ko kukuha ng mga datos, diba, di ba, na mga datos mula sa kanila. Kasi parang may aversion din talaga sila doon sa queerness nga, di ba? As a matter of fact, alam niyo ba na merong manok na binabae, di ba? May binabaeng manok, di ba? Yung manok na bawal nga siya actually ipanglaban kasi ang problema sa binabaeng manok, mukha siyang hen. So, ang tendency ay itong mga tandang ina-avoid siya kasi nga akala nila babae. Pero kapag tumalikod na yung tandang, iaanohin nung rooster. Ang isa, for the chika lang, ang isa sa mga pinakatanyag na breeder nitong binabaeng manok ay si Claudine Barreto, 'di ba? So ayun, 'di ba? So again, ayun nga, parang ito, papunta na sa serious part, di ba? Siniseryoso. So parang ayun nga, parang sa tingin ko, dahil doon sa 3 buwan ko ng pagpapanggap, sa tingin ko talaga, na ito, at inaakala ko kasi talaga na parang ito yung realidad ko dahil muli, tinuruan kasi ako at wala talaga kasi akong espasyo na kilalanin nga yung sarili ko. At tuwing umuwi ako mula sa sabungan, nanggaling ako kasama doon sa mga game farms na ito, doon sa Bulacan, parang doble-doble yung pagod ko. Hindi lamang dahil doon sa etnografiya na ginagawa ko, pero kung di pati doon sa nakakapagod na at the end of the day, hindi mo rin mauwian yung sarili mo. Diba? Na parang hindi mo na alam kung saan natatapos yung pagpapanggap na ginagawa mo sa etnografiya at pagpapanggap na ginagawa mo sa pang-araw-araw mong buhay. So it has something to do with bodily choreographies talaga eh. Lagi mo siyang ginagawa, akala mo ito yung bagay na ikaw talaga. Pero hindi talaga ikaw yan. Di ba? Kaya nga, sa tingin ko, isa sa mga batis at paraan kung paano ko unti-unting kinikilala at tinuturuan ko yung sarili kong sumayaw at gumalaw sa sarili kong indayog ay yung pag-enroll ko sa dance classes, di ba? Sa punto, somewhere in this timeline, ay na-realize kong trans ako. Ganun na lang yung isipin nyo, di ba? At habang tinatanggap ko itong identidad na ito, na hindi ko nga namamalayan na ako pala iyon, ay nakakatuwa kasi para ka talagang bata o sanggol na natututo muli na tumayo sa sarili mong paa. Diba? At sa pagkakataon na ito, hindi mo na hinahayaan yung mga tao sa paligid mo na magdikta kung paano ka ba talaga dapat maglakad, di ba? Sumusunod ka nga sa sarili mong indayog. Sa tingin ko, kasi napag-iisipan ko din habang sinasabi ni Sir Hide, kanina halimbawa yung allowing yourself to make mistake, queer failures. Sa tingin ko kasi parang yun yung maaaring ituro sa atin ng sayaw bilang isang art form eh. Kapag nasa klase ka, may tendency kasi isipin mo lagi na parang dapat nasusunod mo yung tamang choreography. Pero kung i-enroll mo talaga yung sarili mo at yung alayunin mo talaga ay makalikha na at makahanap ng komunidad mula sa mga dance classes na to, marirealize mo na okay lang palang magkamali. At mula doon sa pagkakamali na yun ay walang masama doon, di ba? Na mahahanap mo yung sarili mo hanggang nga sa gumalaw ka doon sa sarili mong beat, di ba? Sa sarili mong pagbibigay ng definisyon sa sarili mo. Especially tayo na lagi tayong lumalaki doon sa isang heteronormatibong espasyo nga na ito lang lagi yung tama. Di ba? Very phallogocentric siya. Di ba? O alam ko din yun. Di ba? Hindi ako naglagay dito. Di ba? Ganun din, di ba? Parang pagpasok ko nga siya sa komunidad, community siya, hindi lang siya parang figure. Of course, bida-bida siya, di ba? Parang kailangan talaga may picture ng sarili niya, di ba? Pero ayun, di ba po si Cat Dolls? So, ayun nga, yung paglikha at pagyakap nitong sarili mo na tinuro nga sa'yo na hindi po posible, na okay lang na magkamali. At hindi ba kapag pag-uusapan din naman natin yung queer bilang teorya, bilang metodo, at hindi lang siguro bilang in academic level, but as a form of living, di ba? As a form of becoming. Hindi ba ang queer di naman talaga ay isang uri ng pagyakap sa mga posibilidad, di ba? Na akala natin nga, siguro ito lang yung point ng story ko, na akala natin kilala natin ang sarili natin. Pero ang tinuturo sa atin ng queerness ay maging bukas tayo dito sa mga horizons na ito, sa mga posibilidad, na baka bukas ay ito ka pala, na okay lang pala na ilagay mo yung sarili mo nga sa mga sitwasyon na hindi mo inaasahan, na makikita mo yung sarili mo sa mga ganong sitwasyon at magugulat ka na ikaw pala yon, di ba? Ang posibilidad ng queer ay nagbibukas sa atin ng mga avenues para kilalanin na meron palang joy dun sa mga bagay na tinuturo sa atin na mali, na dapat nating iwasan. At payagan yung sarili natin na magkamali, di ba? At dahil nga sa baka gahol na ako sa oras ay tatapusin ko na lang doon yung aking presentasyon. Diba? Maraming salamat. Kaya nasira ko na siya. Ayan, clearing yan, clearing. Pagwasa ako, di ba?
Okay, napaka-interesanteng pagtuhog ng sarili, sabong at sayaw. Um, okay, our fourth speaker is, sorry. Okay, Miss Isola Tong. Isola is an installation artist, writer, organizer, and educator whose practice bridges craft, new media, and community engagement, tracing the overlap between personal, political, and the numinous. She gathers and transforms materials from local environments into sculptural basketry, weaving together temporal, social, and geographic incidents. Her work explores the intersections of ecofeminism, climate anthropology, trans theory, and post-colonial cosmology. She graduated with an MFA in Environmental Art and Social Practice at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a BS in Architecture at the University of Santo Tomas. She also writes climate fiction and essays that engage with these themes, contributing to critical discourse through various publications. Her writing was published in Transgender Studies Quarterly, by Duke University Press, Queer Spaces, by the Royal Institute of British Architects, and Ship Space by United States Artists. Her projects have been exhibited both locally and internationally at institutions such as Het, New Institute in Rotterdam, Museum of Contemporary Art, Metalkova, Post Territory Oujinguk in Seoul, A+ work of art in Kuala Lumpur, University of the Philippines Vargas Museum, and the Cultural Center of the Philippines. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Isola Tong.
Hello. I'm not really sure how to feel about being last. So I'm a bit, yeah. Yeah, so hello. Hello everyone. I hope everyone's still awake. May mga pumipikit na dyan. So I also came from a class sa UP. I was teaching Arts 1. I'm teaching about materials and then lumabas yung picture ni Toma Finland. Do you know who Toma Finland is? Yeah, with like the really luscious musculature with nipples. So medyo funny na merong parang, what do you call this, like, pagbabadya kanina sa lecture ko of what's gonna happen. So, yeah, I divided my presentation into three topics. So, yeah, my presentation about my current artistic process and the forces that shaped it will be signposted by three categories: the femme gatherer, pyrrhic affinities, and weaving as worlding. So the first post will focus on the framework of my visual practice and poetics influenced by vernacular basketry and thoughts around baskets and gathering by Donna Haraway and Ursula Le Guin. Secondly, I will focus on how my encounters with Indigenous American craft and local environments in California shaped my current trajectory into basket making. And lastly, the process involved in my art making, which in itself a practice of hair, world making through being with or staying with materials and people. So a lot of these words have echoes from what was referenced earlier, like Jack Halberstam, what's the other, the Munoz, Esteban Munoz also. But in my presentation, I'm going to focus on specifically Donna Haraway's work, which is not specifically, overtly trans or queer, but I find her cyborg theory very, very such, So to begin, so this is the book that I'm very inspired with. Yeah. So it was here in Ateneo in the Rizal Library where I first encountered the writings of Donna Haraway. I was looking for a theoretical framework on which my self-knowledge as a blossoming trans femme queen could anchor. I looked into cyborg theory to understand my identity and my condition within the context of the post-colonial and critical gender discourse in recent times. In my MFA study at the University of California, Santa Cruz, also the home of Donna Haraway and another influential trans theorist, Susan Stryker, I came across The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction by Ursula Le Guin as a reading assignment by my professor, Laurie Palmer. The carrier bag theory proposes that perhaps the first cultural technology was a container rather than a spear. So, remember in paleontology, there's a theory that we were hunter-gatherers. So this theory focuses more on the narratives around baskets and vessels. Before weapons of domination and destruction, before the heroic tales of hunting, there were vessels for gathering, bringing, and sharing. Here, Le Guin highlights the shift towards life-giving narratives of nurture, sustenance, and collaboration. The act of gathering, nurturing, and basket making is inherently within the spectrum of the sacred feminine, the divine mother, the valley, that mysterious cave that fosters new worlds rather than destroying them. So, there was earlier there's a lot of discussion about phallogocentric images. Now I'm turning like the opposite way, parang bottom. Parang gano'n, nandun ako sa bottom spectrum spectrum of things. Um, so Oh, it's a bit. You'll see here a picture. Actually, you could see this in Wikipedia from it's an archival photo from Field Museum portraying a potter at work in Mindanao. So there's a cis woman doing the pottery, and then opposite is uh, a bakla, a bayot, you know, doing the same sort of activity as the female. So I'm very moved by this image because it shows how back in the day, it's our society was more attuned to this sort of non-essentialist in worldview on gender. So I see myself in that person as an artist. And I see here how craft is inherently a very femme. I'm saying femme because I'm trying to be more inclusive about the feminine energy. Um, so so studying in California really affected me a lot. Um, it's kind of funny because it's the land of high technology. It's the cradle of AI technology, Silicon Valley. But then it's actually there where I found parang balik loob to a deeper past. Um, it felt like the energies of like Native Americans haunted me because it wasn't so obvious. I mean, I went there around the pandemic before October 7. So it was unbeknownst to me how dire the genocide that happened in North America was. I kind of knew, but I wasn't like it wasn't like in my consciousness. So but then I went to the Natural History Museum of Santa Cruz, where you see Santa Cruz is situated in. And I saw a mural of the Ohlone people. So it was actually the Ohlone people who lived in the land. And there's a picture of a woman. Her name is Linda Yamane, who's the last. Actually, they forgot how to do the craft of basket making, but they sort of reverse engineered it and learned from like the what was left by their ancestors. Um, so that is kind of cut, but there's an image of a basket made by her ancestors. So that really moved me and and pushed me into basket research and basket making. So you can see here, so this picture depicts the basketry found in the museum in California. And then dun sa right is a basket weaving in the Visayas region. So I'm sort of just juxtaposing it to portray like very similar, no? Like the patterns and the way the materials are manipulated is somewhat the energy is there. So I'm trying to sort of I'm trying to explore this connection between these two heritage and geographies. But obviously the materials used sa Santa Cruz is different. They use indigenous materials found in the land. Like they have a specific grass called tule. It's how do it doesn't exist. It's like it has an appearance of a papyrus plant. Parang ganun siya. Na matigas. And then and then they use other sorts of grasses found in their land. And then on the other side is a Visayan basket weaving. And then I also got influenced by, I was not commissioned, but I got a fellowship with the Norse um, Center, where they house these nests donated by the alumni of the university. And I found how similar bird technology is to human technology. And it's quite interesting to see that they're capable of design. I grew up, for context, I grew up here in Metro Manila and in Pasay, which is very dense, very urban. So I don't really interface a lot with nature, but it was here where I started hearing birds. Not just hearing birds, but actually listening to them, acknowledging that they're there. Kasi back in the, they're again, they're not in my full consciousness before because it's so loud, di ba, dito? Like, um, there's just background noises from, industrial sources. And so here I realized so many things about what being human is through animals and animal architecture. And so, yeah, moving forward, here is another observation that influenced the trajectory of my practice. So, California and the Philippines are connected underneath by what geologists call the Pacific Ring of Fire. Are you familiar with that? Yeah. It's a horseshoe-shaped belt of seismically active volcanoes and earthquake epicenters. Our islands were formed by the rubbing or the violent rubbing between the Philippine plate and the Eurasian plate, whereas California is situated between the rubbing of the Pacific plate and the North American plate, but both are geographically linked by or along the fringes of the Pacific basin. And so the plant life and the climate in California make the landscape naturally receptive to fire, and the landscape perennially burned. So much so that the Spanish conquistadors who came to the indigenous lands called it Tierra del Fuego, or Land of Fire. And then on the other side of the Pacific, there's the Philippines, where the landscape also burns out of the infernal rage of our tempestuous volcanoes. So I'm sort of connecting to these two geographical realities through my work. So California is a very dry landscape. It's a very dry geography, owing to its location in in North America. So parang ano kasi siya eh, how would I describe California? It's called a chaparral. It's the accurate term for it. Hindi siya desert kasi it's closer to to Mediterranean climate than like Saudi Arabia. So it's kind of like in between. So there are vegetation. And historically, Native American Indians deliberately burned their landscape because it's like the kaingin that we have here. So they do that to encourage more plants, more crops to grow. But then after the states was colonized, there were these practices stopped happening, but then the landscape stayed receptive to fire and burning. Do you get what I'm trying to say? So when that stopped, like other factors, like other natural factors, contribute to the burning, specifically climate change. So kasi nawala yung mga tao dati yung mga tao yung nagsusunog. So ngayon, yung climate, yung mismong weather na yung gumagawa ng deed for them. So one unfortunate consequence of this is the Sima Dome fire in Mojave Desert. So I went there with my cohorts, to it's actually a photography class, pero I'm not really a photographer. Sumama lang ako for the vibes, you know, because it's a desert and it's fun. There's free lodging. Kasi the UC system is very generous. Like if you're a UC student, you can stay in either of these like national parks with you know with a fancy cabin. Sabi nila cabin lang. So mababa yung expectation ko, 'di ba? Pero yung cabin nila may industrial kitchen. So I was like, okay, empire. It, you know, it's giving empire. Diba? So, yeah, it was so fancy. Pero nasunog to. And it's crazy to think about deserts burning, 'cause, you know. But apparently, the entire forest of Joshua trees burned down, so it's just gone. Nothing was left. So it's very it's a very depressing sight to see. Um, So yeah, of course, I don't wanna. I want to stay with trouble, as what um, who says that Donna Haraway says. But I also want to be hopeful. Um, so this i- picture is from UP Vargas Museum, actually, which I saw recently. It's part of the controversial PCGG collection. It was you know, it's from the Marcoses. So but I objectively, without that history, like this painting, it's a Yugoslavian naive painting. It's a sort of folk art. No, wala silang training talaga na formal. It's by an artist, Franjo Klopotan. And it's very powerful, you know, to see the basket with the sort of parang may mga bahay and grass and then birds around it. So it's very surreal, but it also sort of encapsulates what I'm trying to imagine in my practice, like weaving and basketry as something that births worlds instead of destroying possibilities. And yeah, so I'm into basketry, like tying it back to the topic of queerness and transness. I find craft, that's why I'm doing it, because I find craft as a very trans practice, especially if you look at how architecture basically is a form of craft. You know, architecture started as craft. Bahay Kubo is one big basket if you think about it, or an inverted one. So this is a church in not in Bacolod, in Negros Occidental, in one of those haciendas, in the Oro Plata Mata house. Have you seen that movie? Yeah, so in that house, there's this church made out of wheel. The walls are made out of wheels. It has a very circular theme, and it echoes the basket from from Summer Island, where my mom is from. The parang inverted lang, but it also echoes the what the this bird did, which I found in in UC Santa Cruz. No, so you know, trans is described as a kind of crossing, as a kind of crossing over or a transgression of border. And craft for me is that sort of practice where you sort of blur the lines between practices and disciplines. For context, I'm a formally trained architect. In you know, I worked for a bit in Japan, and then I work here also, but I sort of focused my energies into my art practice. Yeah, so this is part of what I do. I gather, I literally gather materials from my environment. This is this is in Teachers Village because I live there. I live there now. I moved there recently because I got a job teaching at UP Diliman. So and then because my mom's from Samar and I go there occasionally. So I have a very fond memory of Banig. Banig for me is a very comforting folk craft. that reminds me of, motherly care and home and warmth and hot summers. Pero malamig yung sahig, di ba yun yung advantage of banig? So, yeah, and then, yeah, I do the same thing with baskets as well. I gather materials from forests and other sources. Sometimes I also get materials from other basket weavers. From Bicol, usually from Bicol actually, because Bicol has a lot of crafts people who could still do basketry. And then this is the bark from the Sima Dome fire that I showed you earlier. So I actually collected some of them. And the way I do it is I weave the basket, and then I paint I make paint from the charred, barks of the Joshua tree, and then mix it with a binder, and then create a paint, an oil-based paint, and then I use that to paint my baskets. So in this way, I sort of it's a way of transing geographies. It's like I'm collapsing time and space into this object, and sort of like, you know, deterritorializing these histories and climactic realities and making connections from them. So this is recently, yeah, that's why I was in Negros Occidental, because I showed this work of mine in a gallery in Bacolod. So I also gathered leaves of like sugarcane leaves from haciendas, from farm, and chicken feathers as well. We're in the topic of chickens earlier. So ayun. So this is like my expression of these like different contexts woven together in this basket. Yeah. So that ends my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isola, for that interesting walkthrough. Okay, your critical practice of basket weaving. So the floor is now open for questions. May we ask the panelists to stay here in front? So for those asking questions, you can just go to the middle, no, of the aisle. There's another mic.
Hello po. I would like to ask po this question to Sir Hide, and to you po. I forgot your name. Sorry. Po. Yes. Sorry po.
Phil.
A while ago, both of you mentioned earlier about about the queer art of failure. I'm actually interested in this. Just to expound, like when you mean by queer art of failure, there's a connection with this to gender performance, in terms of how queer people attempt to queer themselves by with mistakes and all, especially through the art of dance. There.
Very queer. So the question is if the queer art of feeling has a connection to gender performance.
Yes.
Correct. Yes, it does. Um, that's a short answer. how would be the next question. It's kind of like gender performance is bound to fail all the time. Even who is the most masculine man that you can think of? Think of him. He even fails at performing masculinity at some point, right? So what the queer art of failure does is embracing that that fact that we never actually fulfill those norms, those scripts to to the fullest or at all. In that sense, it's very much connected. Yes. Want to add something, Phil?
Hello. Ay, sorry. Ayan. Same. Charot lang. Di ba? Actually, parang kasi, ano, maganda kasi sinasabi talaga ng mga speakers, okay? Halimbawa, yung nabanggit ni Miss Isola, di ba? Na parang staying with the trouble. And parang allowing yourself to make mistakes. Sa tingin ko parang yun kasi talaga yung parang queer mode of thinking na dapat mayroon tayo. Kasi kagaya nga ng sinabi ni Hide, na parang any kind of performance na ginagawa mo under this heteronormative society, failure talaga siya lagi. Di ba? Even if you're queering or parang creating, halimbawa, an anti-logos of your body outside of this very patriarchal and phallogocentric idea of masculinity, laging may mali talaga, na parang laging may kulang at laging sasabihin sa'yo na ano yan? Halimbawa, gusto mo nga mag-resist, di ba? Gusto mong i-embrace yung ano mo, yung pagiging bakla mo, may failure pa rin dun minsan kasi parang sabihin, ay, hindi ka tanggap-tanggap dito kasi feminine ka. Doon ka sa mask for mask lang dito, di ba? So parang meron nga laging mali, di ba? So siguro parang yung sinasabi namin na parang queer openness to failure, para kasing parang siguro yung point nung bagay, siguro himayin muna natin yun, no? Parang pag sinabi natin na parang allowing yung failure na yon, kailangan natin kasing buwagin sa isipan natin na yung failure is something that is negative. Kailangan kasi, di ba, parang kailangan mo siya tingnan na tuwing nagkakamali ka, nagbibigay sa iyo ngayon yun ng mga possibilities nga na ito yung pwede ko pang gawin. 'Di ba? Ito yung pwede pang mangyari. 'Di ba? Kaya nga horizons, 'di ba? Staying with the trouble, ing, becoming, 'di ba? Hindi siya natatapos to something, to an identity. For example, yung transness din, 'di ba? Na parang para kasing parang ano siya eh, parang yung goal, for example, yung idea natin sa transness ay yung passing. Alam niyo ba yung passing, di ba? This idea on trans lives na you should expect, when you're transitioning, you should expect to become, halimbawa, this very woman na Amazon, babae, di ba? Angel Galang sa Drag Race, di ba? Pero kasi parang maganda rin na kasi na parang i-queer mo yung idea ng queerness na yon. Di ba? Dahil nga, baka kasi parang masyado ng parang nanigas, yung nanigas, nanigas yung idea natin ng mga parang mga islands na to na pupuntahan mo, di ba? Dapat nga rhizome siya, di ba? So baka yun yung failure, parang pagbubukas mo sa sarili mo na about possibilities. Baka yun yung gustong arukin talaga nung ano na yun, nung salita na yun. Okay.
So failure leads to possibility.
Yes, di ba? Kapag natumba ka, nagkamali ka ng pas de bourrée, di ba? Ano yung pwede mong gawin, di ba? Kaya nga ang favorite, sorry na nagtitake ako ng space, yung walking ang favorite ko na dance step. Kasi talagang wala siyang dance step. Gagawin mo lang talaga at open ka talaga doon sa, ano pa yung mangyayari.
I see. Sige, thank you po.
Landed question.
Hi. This question, well, it can be directed towards anyone, but specifically Mark. Also, hi, Mark. I was your student like 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, so we probably didn't see each other on video.
See it. You probably didn't see me, but the required reading of The Death of Vivek Oji has still affected me. I'm sorry that I haven't read the other books that you recommended.
It's okay, nabigyan na kita ng grades. So okay na yun.
But yeah, my question is, where would you draw the line between using your queerness or transness for art and commodifying your queerness?
Um, that's a pretty good question, no? And I'm gonna be approaching it from, I guess, maybe a more slanted perspective. Like I was reading recently because I assigned it in a class, the essay by Saidi Hartman, Venus in Two Acts. And Venus in Two Acts is this essay about the transatlantic slave trade. And there, according to Saidi Hartman, there's always this recurrent figure of the um, Negro girl, right, who is largely absent, who is spoken about but doesn't actually have a voice, right? There were two accounts, for instance, that Saidi Hartman talks about where you have the captains of the ships, which would kind of carry like these slaves from one place to another, actually killing these women, right? Raping them and then killing them. Yung ganyan. And Saidi Hartman is a fictionist. And she's wondering how to deal with this archive that is loaded with violence, right? And she, when thinking about it, kind of concocts this term called critical fabulation, where she talks about how there is a need to kind of make sure that these girls, right, actually are, I guess, maybe not relegated to the trash bin of history, right? So there is a need to write about them, right? But then at the same time, if you're a writer living in the present and you're an author who gets to publish your books, right? You have to admit that there is a very mercenary, utilitarian quality to what you're doing, right? Because even if you do have a noble mission, which is to kind of make sure that this history does not get buried alive, you're also ensuring that your name as an author lives on, eh? Right? Sisikat ka, whether you like it or not, based on that kind of work, right? So, whatever act of nobility that you engage in actually ultimately gets devoured by that capitalistic act of actually being part of the literary market by writing that work. Right? I'm saying that in the sense because to a certain extent, it's kind of difficult to actually resist completely commodification. Right? For as long as you're an author, your work, whether you like it or not, is going to be commodified, right? Even if it means kind of selling it to your friends, being as independent as possible, right? You're still participating within a kind of market logic, right? So I guess maybe the question for you, right, if you're a queer author, is to figure out, diba, how you can do that in an ethical, in as ethical a manner as possible, right? It's not just your queer identity that you're selling whenever you're writing your work. It's also your identity in terms of class, for instance, in terms of your citizenship, right? And these are trigger points for a lot of people, right? And I suppose maybe one way to kind of make sure that there is ethics in the way that you proceed is to kind of maybe figure out whether the kind of collectives you're kind of incorporating in your writing, right, are actually treated fairly, right? Not reduced to stereotypes, for example, right? And I guess maybe that's like one way for me to kind of respond to your question. It's a lot more complicated than that, but at the moment, that's what I can think of. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about my role as an artist vis-a-vis a craftsman or a woman. You know, in art history, the artist's identity started around the Renaissance, I think. Yeah, the Renaissance, you know. Before that, people who built, say, the Notre Dame Cathedral were anonymous collective. And now that I'm doing craft, I've been thinking about the Mingei identity in Japan. You know, Mingei, aka folk craft, because the Japanese they were like the medieval Europeans back in the day when they don't really care about putting their names in the something as trivial as a teapot. But you know, the teapot is beautiful, but then you know, and the beauty of that is art is integrated in their everyday lives in the design of things. And so I've been thinking a lot about that. But then I cannot go back to that state either because I'm in this context where I can't be not a non-artist. This has been an argument in my cohort in my MFA program because there were real you know, like eco warriors who were uncomfortable with the idea of showing eco-critical work within culture, within institutions, because they find, especially in America, America is a very fraught place, as you know. A lot of institutions, even academic spaces, are ultimately linked to, like, you know, the weapons manufacturers, etc. So, but I agree with what was said earlier by Mark about we just do what we can within our capacities and try to be as ethical as we could. And I don't know, it's a difficult question. Yeah, it is a very difficult question. It's, yeah, ethical dilemma. But yeah, I don't know, you have anything to add to that? Yun lang. It's hard, especially as a creative. Yeah, yeah. But I don't want to punish myself either. Yeah.
I'm kind of thinking about it in relation to how, like, exponentially AI, for instance, right, has developed. Like, I had this friend who kind of wanted AI to create a poem, and like he showed it to me, and I realized that, my God, this is the kind of poem that's even better than some of the stuff I've received in my, like, undergrad poetry workshop classes. Unfortunately, yung ganyan, right? And if you think about it, given the kind of capacity that AI has now, which can so far, in the nearest future, outstrip us as creators, diba? There is a need to kind of maintain that self. Kasi that's the only way for us as individuals to know that we're actually talking to people or conversing with people whenever we encounter a work of art or whenever we read poetry or a novel, right? So like there has to be a need to kind of maintain that self alongside the work that's being put out there, right? But then yun nga, parang you're also kind of considering that in relation to the like ethical complications that you kind of bring with you because you are embedded in particular collectives, right? But yun, I think you can't go back to that notion of anonymity, I think, especially these days.
Thank you.
Hi. Hi. I know that at some point we talked about how your like creativity or your art has helped you rehabilitate with your identity. But how has your art also harmed you in some way? Yeah. Anyway. And like how did you like just come to terms with it? Because at some point I know that with art you have to kind of be really vulnerable to kind of give it that signature. So how did it in some way like you try to help your art by giving it your all, but then it kind of started to dwindle the line between like becoming too much of you and not just the art itself?
I think I did art in the first place because it's a place where you can speak in metaphors. And I think that's how I go around it, by speaking metaphorically. I'm not directly, I am putting myself directly out there, but it's sort of masked in these, poetic images or quotes that are not, I don't know. It's not a defense, but it's more like a holder of things about myself, but it's not entirely me. So I don't know. So I guess if it gets attacked, it's fine because it's not my entirety, you know. But I know metaphors. I've been thinking about metaphors a lot. I think, especially in the field of visual arts, it's been a lot of, authenticity. Sometimes I hate that word, and it's good, but these days in social media, sometimes I hope for less authenticity and less, like I want to see less of people, authentic moments of people. You get what I mean? I've been reading this. I don't know if maybe you don't like this author, but Byung-Chul Han. He's a German Korean philosopher. She's been thinking about, for example, the aesthetics of the internet, for example, how he sort of argues that before, I guess before modernity happened, we had more codes, social codes that sort of serves as a lubricant for society. But now that's gone because we're sort of like in that era where we just we're allowed to be vulgar and crass online. And I think I don't know, we're kind of also oversaturated with that representation. So a little bit of artifice for me. I mean, I used to do drag before. Um, you know, performance. A little bit of performance and theatricity and theatrics would be nice, I think. I don't know if I answered your question. I think I'm just rambling.
No, that's
But
fine.
in terms of getting hurt, I don't know. Have I been hurt?
My
Biglang
bad.
ganon. Honestly, I feel more loved, actually, than hurt by being more honest about, not honest in a very like trying to be just, I'm strategic about vulnerability and how I package it in these metaphors in my practice. Like the basket, basic, for example, it's not saying, trans lives matter, but but it expresses in an abstracted way the ideas, ideologies, and feelings that I want to express about what it means for me, being, living as a trans person. Yeah.
Do you also write?
I'm a literature student, so yeah.
No, I mean, because it's like I'm wondering if like the notion of harm you're talking about has to do with, for instance, friends or maybe family members kind of having difficulty with you being very public about, for instance, issues of yourself or issues within the family, right? Private matters that should ideally be kept private suddenly acquire a kind of public platform by virtue of what you write.
I mean, I asked the question mainly because just like you said, there's like this need to be authentic with your work. But also I feel like, uh, especially with how sometimes I would read a work, I tend to wonder what the author, like how much of the life of the author is in the work. And because most of the stuff I've been reading recently has been very dark because of the theories that I would tend to go to. So that's why I was like wondering like how much of an author should be in their work, especially if they're a queer author, and especially if there's a patriarchal society that condemns queer authors.
But I'm thinking of that in relation to how, for instance, the notion of vulnerability, to use Isola's term, parang feels like a saturated element of the pop cultural market, right? Where, for instance, if you want someone to appear authentic, you expect them to kind of disclose all the very private details of their lives to the point that it acquires a kind of spectacular element. 'Di ba? Parang you are vulnerable or you are authentic because ini-explain mo na, pinapakita mo sa audience yung lahat ng bagay. Where yun nga, parang authenticity can also be a decision to keep to yourself, actually. Yun, parang not everyone is the kind of person who freely divulges details about their lives. Sometimes the claim to privacy, di ba, is actually the authentic version of the self. Right? And yun nga, parang that's, I think, one thing that we have to also be aware of when you're thinking queerly in terms of artworks and in terms of literature. Right? There is supposed to be a kind of resistance to what you're expected to do and you're expected to perform as. Right? Which is why metaphors are important. Right? Which is why, for instance, in the case of Phil, di ba, parang like the kind of movements that she decided to kind of perform in dance, di ba, parang feel like to a certain extent rehearsals of a desire that were delayed, for instance, by virtue of the codes that she or they felt compelled to subscribe to at certain points of their lives. Yung ganyan, right? Sometimes there is a need to exercise what needs to be exercised, but also sometimes the authentic self demands a space for themselves where they can shut out everybody else. And art, being what it is, has to be able to accommodate those decisions, right? I want to refuse, I want to retreat. Art has space for that, right? And that's what I think maybe queer art is supposed to be, or can be, or should be.
Ako, na-hurt ako financially. Charot lang. Bakit kaya mag-transition, di ba? Pero siguro kasi since nababanggit naman yung mga horizons kanina na nagbubukas, siguro isa sa hurt na nararanasan ko ngayon bilang isang anthropologist ay yung mga horizons na nagsasara. Kasi halimbawa, ayan nga, parang gusto ko ipagpatuloy nga yung research ko sa sabong. Sa tingin ko parang hindi na ako handa na bumalik dun sa ganong espasyo even if I want to continue nga na yung pag-aaral ko. Kasi parang mahirap na eh, di ba? Parang mag-i-stand out at mag-i-stand out ka talaga. At nakakatakot siya na pasukin muli yung mga ganong mga at parang mapalad nga ako sa tingin ko na gumagalaw ako sa mga espasyo na progresibo sa tingin Ateneo, UP, di ba? At ayun, siguro parang outside academic life na lang din. Siguro parang pati yung mga lugar mo kung saan pwede kang mag-exist lang bilang tao talaga. Halimbawa, parang saan ka pwede mag-apply ng trabaho, gano'n, di ba? Especially at trans lives, di ba? Kasi yun nga, parang nakakatakot lang din kasi talaga na parang makulong tayo dito sa haraya na ito na parang ligtas yung paligid natin dahil pang araw-araw nating nakakita na go, di ba? Yay, di ba? Celebrate queerness, ganyan, ganyan, ganyan. Pero paglabas mo ng katipunan, wala naman may pake sa they, them pronouns mo, di ba? Pupurihin pa yung beard mo, girl, di ba? So ganun, sa tingin ko parang in as much as we're talking about horizons opening for us as queer people, and parang finding community outside of these very heteronormative spaces, siguro malaking part ng hurt ay, ayun nga, yung mga horizons din or para mga possibilities din na nawawala sa'yo. Diba? Kasi ayun, at mahirap at masakit na tanggapin yon. Yung mga taong mapipilitan kang iwan, yung mga espasyong alam mong hindi mo nagagalawan, at yung mga, ayun nga, mga ganung mga bagay na mapupersa kang i-abandon.
Thank you.
Ganun, ayun ko. Ganun talaga eh. Pag yung, sabi nga kanina, diba, may inherent risk talaga in being queer. And yung hurt part talaga siya noon. As much as I don't want that to happen to you or everybody else. Pero, part siya, be real lang. Oo, okay lang rin masaktan. Pero, saktan mo na lang sin sila. Yun. Oo. Pala di. May violence pala.
The last question for the panel. We have 5 minutes left. Is there a final question?
Hi, Marcus mentioned earlier the queerness in writing. Let's per se, you are a writer and you wrote something about, you're advocating something in your writing. But because of homophobia of a lot of people, the advocate that you're writing has gone to waste. How would you respond to that situation? And if ever you respond to it in a negative side, how would you regain or build back your confidence in writing that advocacy?
My God. No, can I just say, like personally, in a lot of ways, like one primary reason why I write poetry has to do with the fact that not a lot of people read poetry. Like maybe 20 people read poetry and like 10 of them are my friends. Yung ganyan. Right? Which allows me to kind of maybe get away with a lot of things. Right? As opposed to, for instance, when you're writing something more accessible like fiction, right? And I think maybe it's also similar to when you're doing specific forms of art. Some forms of art are less commercially viable than others. Yung ganyan, right? And to a certain extent, there is a kind of maybe inverse relationship between the kind of freedom you're entitled to, right? And the kind of maybe audience that you have, right? You're freer if there are fewer people looking at you, yung ganyan, or appraising your work, right? To a certain extent, the kind of maybe negation of advocacy that you're asking about is something that I'm blessed to not have happened to me yet. Having said that, I do like belong to a literary community where parang for the longest time, I guess maybe literature that focuses on identity is considered less. Like I remember being part of this like literary festival where there was this writer like Butch Macan Santos, right, who was talking about how he was writing poetry dealing with climate change. And when it was my turn to speak, like I pretty much talked about gender. Tapos sabi niya, anong point ng pagsusulat sa gender kung nagugunaw na ang mundo? Yung there's that notion na parang there are other larger problems to consider than I guess maybe notions about gender and queerness, etc., etc. Right? I think when faced with such dilemmas, I would highly encourage anger and wrath. Ganyan. Kasi diba, parang like the thing is, diba, parang like people expect you to behave in a really proper manner eh. Right? I just came out of a like a lecture by Dorothy Wong. A lot of people, like a good number of people like who are in the audience also attended that. An Asian American scholar, and at some point she talks about the kind of policing of tone that happens to poets, right, in the context of American literature, right? How, for instance, angry black poets, diba, are considered less, right? And you're, I think, maybe deemed more acceptable if you're an African American poet who's able to write within the kind of trope or language of that is favored by like white people, white producers. Yung ganyan. So parang, but I mean, as has been pointed out by the panel, like you are, when you're dealing with queer poetry, for instance, or queer art, like you are coming from a position where the risk is real, is true, is a lived experience. So kung magagalit ka at gusto mo magtaray, magtaray ka, my God. Kasi like it's not just your work that's being called into question, it's your very existence eh. Right? So yun, lash out is my answer. Anger.
Manabuno. Manuka.
Thank you.
Okay, that's it. Okay, thank you very much, the four, Phil, Isola, Hiden, and Mark, for bringing your own perspectives to the topic. I'm sure every everyone, not just me, okay, because of your presentations, okay, are more or less more enlightened regarding, okay, the significance of queering, okay, art forms. To close the panel, okay, is AB Lit Junior Luane Suarez.
Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you for being with us for today's event. I am Liwaine Suarez from 3AB Literature English under the Literary and Cultural Studies program, or LCSP. First and foremost, we would like to thank our staff and student volunteers from LCSP and PLUME our wonderful speakers, you, our lovely guests, and everyone who made this program possible. For the very first Ateneo Literary and Cultural Festival, we really wanted to have some time dedicated to discussing and promoting queer art forms. Because we in LCSP want to promote inclusivity and foster a safe space for people of all sexualities and gender identities. To gather and share not just their own artworks, but also their encounters with other queer art. If I may speak on behalf of the student body, I believe that it is important for us to be exposed to these kinds of dialogues about the experiences and motivations of the LGBTQIA plus creators and artists because it may inspire us to explore our own sexual orientations, gender identities, and forms of expression. For instance, perhaps today's discussion may inspire some of you to write your own queer literature or make your own queer artworks. Or at the very least, we hope that this talk would encourage you to interact and engage yourself more with queer art and even queer media. Furthermore, I think that it also helps those who are not part of the queer community to understand the struggle that being a queer person entails and what kind of art can develop or bear fruit from such a context. Whether it be experiences regarding gender dysphoria, homophobia, or transphobia and the like, I feel like it would be good for students like us to be more aware of these realities so that we are able to empathize more and so that we may be more aware of certain misconceptions about being queer. And yeah, personally, I find queer art forms to be very interesting as what I have gathered from their presentations earlier. Queer art can come in many forms. It is experimental, is strange, unfamiliar, and not so straightforward. I find it to be a beautiful sentiment to see this idea of being different or being othered and viewing queerness as a positive thing or as an art form. Queer art form is not just limited to expression, it is also queer interpretation. With these, I hope that more students are able to explore queer art and learn about perspectives and narratives outside of heteronormative spaces. In literary and cultural studies, we often study and discuss these kinds of topics. And speaking for my fellow lit majors, I believe that it is necessary for LCSP to lead conversations about subjects such as queer art forms so that more people outside of our discipline can be made aware of such topics and can learn more about the culture of the LGBTQIA plus community and how queer art forms can be used to express and convey their cultural context. That being said, shameless plug, you are also invited to join us tomorrow at the MVP roof deck from 1 p.m. to 8 p.m. We have various performances, open mic, and other fun activities lined up for your enjoyment. You are welcome to participate in these activities in case you have any queer poems or stories that you would like to share, or maybe some songs by queer artists that you would want to perform, in hopes that we can impart what we learned here today about queer art forms. It would be very much appreciated. That will be all. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
So, hi guys. Let me just crash course this. So, these will be the course offerings of LCSP for the second semester. So, Introduction to Translation, guys. I love this course so much. This was my favorite course last semester. Literatures of the Philippines, two literary and cultural studies, post-colonial literature, Asian and Latin America, world literature, the theories, and transnationalities across Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Punta na ako dun sa pinakababa, literature, sexuality, and urban space. Wow! Imperial and post-colonial Nosology, poetry to the 19th century, and literature and the law. Please enlist in them for the second semester. I promise you're gonna love them. Promise, 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 promise. Thank you. So ayon, let me just end it right now because I feel like we've extended a little bit. So, ayun, thank you everyone for adding on to the discussion. Thank you din to the guest speakers. And thank you for attending and participating in the first ever Ateneo Literary and Cultural Festival. This is Gabriel Rico signing off. Thank you very much.